Hello everyone, I know you watch this video to accompany you to sleep. So if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to tell me where you are from and what time you watched this video. Let's jump straight into the story. Story 1. He buried her with his own hands, sealed the box, covered it with dirt, walked away without looking back, told the police she disappeared, told himself no one would ever find out, and for 10 years no one did. But on a quiet night, there was a knock at his door, and when he opened it, she was standing there soaked, silent, and staring straight through him like she never left. She didn't explain how she got out. She didn't say where she'd been. She didn't ask for anything. She just said, "Do you still bury your mistakes?" And now the question is, how did she survive? Why didn't she speak up? And what does she want now? Because if the dead can knock, what else can they do? Insisting that no matter how little they had, their names would stay clean. Diane learned early how to carry herself with pride, how to speak only when she had something to say, and how to endure things others would never know she'd been through. She was smart. She didn't need to raise her voice to make a point. By 16, she was tutoring other students in math. By 18, she had a full scholarship to a teacher's college, one of the few black women in her class. And by the time she graduated in 1972, she was already being recruited by the local school district to take over a struggling middle school in Nash County. It was there, standing in front of a class full of students with more problems than pencils, that she met the man who would change the course of her life. Marcus Stovall was tall, quiet, and clean-cut. A diesel mechanic who came in to fix the school bus on a Tuesday afternoon. He wasn't flashy, didn't smile much, but he noticed Diane. She wore pressed slacks, wire-framed glasses, and had a habit of standing with both hands behind her back. He said she reminded him of someone who didn't need help, but deserved it anyway. Their first conversation was about carburetors. Their second was about gospel music. Their third ended with a walk around the school parking lot. And the next thing anyone knew, they were inseparable. They got married in 1974 in a small Baptist church, with no more than 40 guests. No reception hall, no designer dress, just a choir, a borrowed veil, and vows they both took seriously. They moved into a modest 2-bedroom home off Highway 97, where Marcus worked double shifts and Diane graded papers at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that always went cold. It wasn't glamorous, but it was consistent, and in Diane's world, consistency was love. Over the next 35 years, they built a life brick by brick. Diane rose through the ranks teacher, then vice principal, then principal, always respected, never questioned. She was the woman who stayed after school for parent meetings, who paid out of pocket for students' lunch if they were short, who still made Sunday dinner even when she had 200 papers to review. Marcus, meanwhile, ran his own auto shop by the 80s, known for honest work and never charging a penny more than necessary. They didn't vacation, they didn't show off, but they made every mortgage payment early. By the time they were in their 50s, they were debt-free. They had 2 children, Kira and Marcus Jr., raised with the same quiet structure. No shouting in the house, no slamming doors, and no skipping church. Diane didn't spoil them. She taught them to solve problems without excuses, to pray with intention, to walk in the world with their heads high, even when it felt like no one was looking. And when Kira went off to pharmacy school and Marcus Jr. took his first job driving cross-state deliveries, Diane stood in the doorway like she always did, proud, unreadable, holding back tears she didn't like to share. In 2007, everything changed. Marcus got sick. At first it was coughing that wouldn't go away, then weakness, then the diagnosis, advanced pulmonary fibrosis. Diane was already planning retirement, but she put everything on hold to care for him. For 2 years, she bathed him, fed him, carried him to the bathroom when his legs gave out. Never once did she ask for help. Never once did she complain. But when Marcus died in late November of 2007, something in her face went still. At the funeral, she didn't cry in public. She stood beside the casket like a soldier on duty, nodding politely as friends whispered, "He's in a better place." She went home to an empty house and washed the bedsheets before anyone else arrived. For the next 3 years, she lived alone. She retired from education in 2009 with a plaque, a thank you speech, and a standing ovation she barely acknowledged. She spent most of her time volunteering at the youth ministry, mentoring teenage girls who reminded her of herself, quiet, strong, underestimated. She read scripture every morning before sunrise. She cooked too much food for one person. And every now and then, she'd talk to Marcus Photo, as if he were still sitting in that brown recliner across the room. Diane was not someone you felt sorry for. She kept her hair neat, her checkbook balanced, and her emotions folded inside like laundry in a drawer. But the silence in that house, it wasn't peace. It was just silence. Her children called often, visited when they could. But they had lives now. And Diane had time. So when a guest preacher from Georgia showed up one Sunday in August 2010 and called her Queen D during the altar call, it did something to her spirit. She hadn't heard her name said with warmth in a long time. He was younger, smooth-talking, clean-cut. Said he'd been praying for God to lead him to a Proverbs 31 woman. Said he wasn't looking for attention, just partnership. And Diane, who had built her entire life around waiting for the right moment, started to believe maybe this was it. She didn't fall fast, but she did fall. And the man she opened her door to was already writing her ending. She met Calvin Barrow in the second week of September 2010 during a revival service at Cornerstone Missionary Baptist Church, where he was introduced as a visiting preacher from Macon, Georgia. He stood at the pulpit with confidence, tailored in a three-piece gray suit, Bible in hand, quoting scripture not from a page but from memory. His voice had rhythm, his pauses had timing, and his eyes knew exactly where to land. He spoke of transformation, of broken things becoming new, of the loneliness that comes after loss, and how God fills that space with unexpected blessings. Diane was seated in the third pew, dressed in a long navy skirt, and her late husband's gold pendant tucked just beneath her blouse. When he spoke, he looked her way, not once, not twice, but with that intentional glance that says, "You're the one this message is for." She didn't move, but she felt it. After the benediction, he walked over with a gentle smile and a soft, "Bless you, ma'am," and something in the way he extended his hand felt careful but studied, like he already knew how to speak to a woman who carried herself like Diane. She thanked him for the message. He told her it wasn't his, it was the Lord's. She said it spoke to her. He said maybe it was meant to. From there, he didn't press. He waited. 3 days later, he showed up at midweek Bible study. No preaching this time. Just listening. Just watching. He told the deacon board he was in town on sabbatical, seeking clarity. Possibly planting a church in the Carolinas if God opened the right door. His story was compelling. Raised in Georgia, started preaching at 19. Had held associate pastor roles in Atlanta and Augusta, stepped away from ministry temporarily after the loss of his mother, but now felt called again to serve. He never said much about where he'd been in between. No photos of congregations, no mention of past churches by name, just enough mystery to make him intriguing, and enough scripture to make him trustworthy. Diane didn't ask many questions at first. He invited her for coffee the following week, and she said yes. They met at a diner on the edge of town, plain, quiet, with chipped booths and weak coffee. He asked about her favorite book of the Bible. She asked where he stayed when he wasn't preaching. He said Proverbs and wherever God provides. He told her he admired her grace, that she didn't carry her loss like a burden, that she wore dignity like a second skin. Diane wasn't flattered easily, but she noticed the difference between empty compliments and words meant to disarm. Calvin's compliments were more dangerous. They sounded like prayers. By early October, he was coming over on Sundays after service. Sometimes he helped clean up after youth ministry meetings. Sometimes he stayed just long enough to pray with her in the kitchen, quoting passages about restoration and new beginnings. Her children started noticing. Kira told her mother she was moving too fast, that this man had no roots, that every story he told about his past felt carefully picked. Marcus Jr. didn't say much, but every time Calvin entered the room, he found a reason to leave. Diane defended him the way women often do when hope feels rare, by leaning harder into faith than into facts. She said God works in mysterious ways. She said sometimes peace doesn't look how people expect it to. Calvin spoke with the kind of ease that made people lower their guard. He quoted just enough pain from his past to seem relatable, but not enough detail to be questioned. He said he'd lost everything before and wasn't chasing wealth, only purpose. But his shoes were always shined. His phone never stopped vibrating, and every time he left Diane's house, he was careful to say a prayer at the door loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. Calvin Barrow wasn't new to pulpits, but he was no stranger to courtrooms either. By the time he stood beside Diane Stovall in her church that December morning in 2010, he had already burned through 2 associate pastor roles in Georgia, one in Augusta and one just outside Savannah. Both ended the same way, quietly, quickly, without ceremony or explanation. The church elders never pushed charges, they just wanted him gone. And each time he packed up, moved cities, and started over with a new story, new scriptures, and new eyes to manipulate. He was 42 years old, unmarried on paper, but emotionally entangled with more than one woman in more than one zip code. He moved around often, never staying in one place long enough to draw too much attention. He didn't own a home, never had. He rented a modest one-bedroom in a rundown part of East Macon. Paid for in cash every month, no mail in his name. Neighbors said he came, and went at odd hours. He drove a clean car with expired plates. He always wore suits, even to the corner store, and kept a Bible in the passenger seat, not for reading but for show. His real business wasn't ministry, it was manipulation, and his targets were consistent: older women with money, pain, and a deep desire to feel seen. They called it hustling blessings. That's what some in the neighborhood whispered behind his back. They said he had a gift not from God, but from knowing exactly how to speak like a man of God. He'd charm his way into prayer meetings, lay hands on strangers in grocery stores, and offer private consultations for healing and life guidance in exchange for love offerings. But what he really did was study people, find the cracks in their lives, and slip through them like smoke. His longest entanglement, though, was with a woman named Trisha Wren. She was 35, sharp-tongued, ambitious, and beautiful in a way that made men stop mid-sentence. She worked as a real estate assistant in Buckhead and had dreams of owning her own salon and boutique space. But Trisha wasn't chasing love, she was chasing leverage. She made it clear early on that she had no use for broke men, no tolerance for excuses, and no interest in patience. No broke men, no broke dreams. She told Calvin one night after he brought her fake designer perfume and promised her a building he hadn't even seen. She had dated hustlers before. She could smell lies before they were even spoken. So when she asked what his plan was, she wasn't joking. Calvin knew he couldn't stall her much longer. He had promised her things, real things, a commercial property, a new car, a better life. And the more she pushed, the more he felt cornered. That's when he started mentioning Diane. At first, just in passing, said she was a widow, said she was lonely, said she was generous. Then he added details that weren't true, said she was older than she was, said she was terminally ill, said she didn't have much time left, said she needed companionship and wanted to leave something behind. Trisha didn't ask questions after that. She just said, handle it. And Calvin set out to do exactly that. He told Trisha he was building trust, that it would take a little time. But behind Diane's back, he was already preparing. He had gone through her files when she wasn't looking. Bank statements, insurance policies, pension documents. He knew what she was worth before she even told him. $1.2 million in life insurance, a paid-off home, clean credit, and no one standing close enough to her to block him. When Diane invited him into her home, he memorized the layout. When she left the room, he studied what was behind her. He noticed which drawers she kept locked and which ones she didn't. When she cooked, he asked about her medications. When she prayed, he watched what made her eyes close longer. He was careful, too careful. He never pushed, never asked directly for anything, never raised his voice. He played the role of the patient man, the one who waits for God's timing. In public, he held her hand. In private, he texted Trisha. And in between, he calculated the distance between trust and death. By November 2010, Calvin was behind on 2 personal loans in Georgia. Civil court judgments had been filed. He owed over $18,000 to creditors and had defaulted on a business partnership the year prior. But no one in North Carolina knew that. He never mentioned lawsuits. He never mentioned garnishments. He just told Diane he was transitioning, that God was shifting his season, and that sometimes the wilderness comes before the promise. He lied about where he lived. Told Diane he had a condo in Atlanta being remodeled. Told her he didn't want her to visit because of the dust. He told Trisha the wedding was part of the setup, that Diane believed it was real, but it was just a necessary step. Trisha didn't care. She only cared about results. He proposed on a Sunday afternoon, late 2010. The weather was clear, the kind of fall day that made the air feel lighter and the sky feel just a little more open. Service had just ended at Cornerstone, and most of the congregation had already filtered out. Diane was still in the sanctuary, speaking quietly with one of the deaconesses about the upcoming youth bake sale. She hadn't noticed Calvin step away during altar call. She didn't see him slip out the back, didn't see the florist arrive, the usher he'd paid $50 to help him carry a small arrangement to the altar. Everything was timed. When she turned around, there he was, standing in front of the pulpit, holding a small white box in one hand, a folded Bible in the other. He wasn't nervous. He was polished, and when he called her name, her whole body froze. She had never been proposed to in public before. Not like this. Not after all these years. Not by a man younger, with a voice like a hymn and a smile rehearsed for the occasion. He didn't drop to one knee. He didn't have to. Instead, he opened the Bible he was holding and read from Ecclesiastes. Two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion. Then he closed it slowly, placed it beside him, and looked her in the eyes. He said, "Diane, you've held life together with your bare hands. You've sacrificed, you've served, and you've been faithful even when no one saw you. I believe God is leading me to be your covering, your peace and your partner. I don't have a fortune. I don't have a mansion. But I have love and I have faith and I have you in my prayers." Then he opened the box. A single silver ring with a small, tear-shaped stone. Not expensive, not showy, just enough. And he said 6 words. "Will you marry me, Queen D?" She didn't answer at first. The room was quiet, but her thoughts weren't. In that moment, everything collided. 35 years with Marcus, 3 years alone. Her daughter's warnings, her son's silence. The idea of waking up next to someone again. But more than anything, the hope. The feeling that maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to finish her story by herself. She nodded slowly, no tears. Just a small smile that broke the quiet lines of her face. And when he placed the ring on her finger, the small group still lingering in the lobby began to clap. Not because they knew him, but because they trusted her. She walked out of that church with her hands full and her guard lowered. And Calvin walked out with something too. Time. Because now he didn't have to guess what she had. She just promised him all of it. As the wedding approached, Calvin changed. He became more focused, more distant. Every conversation with Diane ended with prayer. Every hug was perfectly timed. Every statement was vague enough to escape questions. Diane chalked it up to nerves. She believed he was trying to be holy, that he didn't want to enter their marriage without spiritual clarity. Her daughter, Kira, saw it differently. "He's hiding something," she told her mother. "He's too polished, Ma. Too new." But Diane waved her off. She believed a man could change. She believed in grace. She believed love sometimes showed up late, but showed up right. And Calvin made sure she kept believing, long enough for him to take what he came for. They got married on December 5th, 2010, in the Fellowship Hall of Cornerstone Missionary Baptist Church. It was modest, just as Diane wanted. 30 guests, no fanfare. No reception hall, just folding chairs, soft hymns, and the scent of rose water and fried chicken drifting from the kitchen next door. Diane wore a navy blue skirt suit with cream gloves, her hair wrapped neatly beneath a lace veil. Calvin wore gray again, the same color he'd worn when they met, with a gold tie she had picked for him. He smiled through the entire ceremony, hands folded tight, voice steady as he said his vows. He even shed a tear when he spoke about loving her like Christ loved the church. Some in the audience whispered that maybe this was a second chance for both of them. But others, including her daughter Kira, sat stiff the entire time, hands in her lap, jaw clenched, watching the way Calvin touched her mother's hand like he already owned it. 2 weeks before the wedding, Diane had changed the beneficiary on her $1.2 million life insurance policy. It had been left to Kira and Marcus Jr. for years, money from her late husband's pension, carefully preserved, untouched for emergencies for legacy. She'd told her children the change was a matter of trust. "If I'm married, my husband should be the one to handle things if anything happens to me," she said. "It's biblical." Kira tried to object, reminded her that this man hadn't even been around for a season yet. Diane reminded her that faith sometimes requires risk. She believed Calvin would protect her, that he would outlive her, that God had brought him to her for a reason. So she signed the papers, and Calvin never once asked her to. By mid-January 2011, things had already started shifting. Diane noticed that money was moving in and out of her checking account in amounts she didn't remember approving. ATM withdrawals at unfamiliar gas stations, out-of-town purchases tagged to her joint debit card, and Calvin's new habit of leaving the house after 9 p.m. for what he called emergency prayer calls with brothers in Atlanta. He always came back before midnight, always showered before bed, and always kissed her forehead without saying much. When she asked what was going on, told her the Lord was working on something private. When she asked again, he said she was doubting him. The third time she stopped asking. Kira, however, didn't. She noticed that her mother's mood was different, quieter, more distracted, less present on their weekly phone calls. When she came by one Saturday morning unannounced and saw Calvin's car missing, Diane said he'd gone to visit a pastor friend in South Carolina. But when Kira checked the glove compartment of Diane's car later that day while pretending to look for tissues, she found a hotel parking receipt dated just 2 nights earlier. 2 guests. 1 room. Augusta, Georgia. She brought it to her mother, trembling, trying not to shout. Diane refused to believe it. That could be anything, she said. It's probably from before we got married. Kira pushed harder. Diane shut down. You don't know what it's like to lose someone and finally feel chosen again. You don't know what that kind of hope feels like, she said. Kira begged her to reconsider the marriage, told her she was being used. Diane ended the conversation by walking into her bedroom and closing the door. What she didn't know, what she would never have imagined, was that while she was defending her husband, he was defending a deadline. Trisha Wren had given Calvin until March 1st to put something real on the table. She wanted a down payment on a storefront in Buckhead, $50,000 minimum. She'd already picked out the location, spoken to the broker, and told friends she was preparing to launch Trisha's Touch, a full-service salon and wellness suite. Calvin had promised it would happen, told her he had a plan, told her his wife was older, vulnerable, getting sick, and had no idea how to manage her money. Trisha didn't ask too many questions. She just wanted results. Every few days she would text him, clocks ticking. He told her to be patient, told her the payout would be clean, no mess, no fingerprints. On the morning of February 19, 2011, Calvin told Diane to pack light, said he had a surprise for her. A quiet Christian couple's weekend away from the noise, just the 2 of them, in a rented lodge tucked deep in Lenoir County, North Carolina. He said it would be about reflection, prayer, realignment. He spoke softly when he described it, with that pastoral calm that made even his lies sound holy. Diane had been worn down by weeks of distance, his absences, his mood swings, but she still believed in the man she'd married. She still believed love was a process, that patience could be a gift. So she packed 2 dresses, her Bible and her favorite herbal tea. She even brought his favorite wool scarf, the gray one he always left on the coat rack but never seemed to wear. Calvin picked her up in a rented Chevy Tahoe, said his own car was in the shop for brake pads, though no shop ever confirmed that. They drove for nearly 3 hours. The roads narrowed. Cell service dropped. The air got colder. Diane made small talk, asked what the theme of the retreat was. He told her it was called Covenant Renewal. She smiled and nodded. She didn't know he made that up while pumping gas on the way there. The lodge sat on private land, surrounded by trees and silence. No staff, no welcome desk, just an old 2-story structure Calvin had reserved weeks earlier under a fake name. He carried the bags inside, lit a few candles, turned off the main lights, and told her they'd start with tea and prayer. She went to freshen up. He went to his duffel bag and pulled out a small pharmacy bottle with no label, just a blue cap and powder white pills ground to dust. He emptied it into her chamomile, stirred slowly, waited. When Diane came back into the room, the tea was already steeped. The mug was warm, waiting, resting on the windowsill like a gesture of peace. She thanked him, sat down and sipped. Calvin pulled out his Bible, opened to Proverbs, and began reading softly, each word slower than the last, his eyes drifting back to her every few seconds. It took 13 minutes. First she blinked longer. Then her head started nodding forward, gently at first, like she was just tired. He asked if she was okay. She mumbled something soft, couldn't form the words. When her body slid down into the cushions, he closed the Bible. What happened next was not fast, it was careful. Calvin walked to the back of the Tahoe and opened the trunk. Inside was a large, heavy wardrobe box from a local moving supply store, double-walled, tall enough for a small adult to fit curled up. It was already prepped with small holes punched through the top and sides, a detail that would later be used to justify what he told Trisha, that he wasn't a monster, that he gave her a chance. He brought the box into the living room, laid it flat, then turned back to Diane. She was still breathing, eyes barely open, body limp. He moved her carefully. First, he bound her wrists with medical tape, then wrapped her ankles. He slid a folded bath towel beneath her head, wrapped duct tape over her mouth, then placed her inside the box with the same ease he used to fold a church bulletin. The box didn't make noise when he sealed it. She didn't either. He loaded the box back into the Tahoe and drove 10 minutes down an unmarked service road that led to a long-abandoned construction zone. The land was overgrown, scattered with rusted metal and broken bricks, once meant for condominiums, now forgotten by developers. He'd visited the site weeks before, marked a soft patch of earth near a broken drainage pipe, just hidden enough that no one would stumble across it unless they were looking. He parked, cut the engine, and sat in silence for a few minutes. Then he got out, opened the trunk, dragged the box across the dirt, and began digging. It wasn't a grave by cemetery standards. It was a trench, just deep enough to conceal the box, just wide enough to fit. When he finished, he lowered the box in gently, covered it with a torn tarp, shoveled earth and broken plaster over the top, and tossed a few rusted fence panels across it like discarded trash. He wiped his hands with a towel, folded it, tossed it into a bag, and drove back to the lodge. On the way, he rehearsed his story. The next morning, February 21st, he returned home and made his first call to the Lenoir County Sheriff's Office. He reported his wife missing, told them they were on a spiritual retreat when she stepped outside early for a prayer walk and never came back, said he searched the woods himself before calling for help, described her clothing in detail, cried once on the phone. By the afternoon, he was standing with deputies and volunteers in hiking boots, calling out Diane's name through the trees like a man searching for his own soul. He handed out flyers with her photo. He joined the prayer circle at church. He gave interviews to local news reporters. He told cameras that he believed in miracles and that if God was testing him, he would remain faithful. There were no scratches on him, no panic in his voice, no tremble in his hands, just sadness, perfectly portioned tears, perfectly timed a story, perfectly built, and a woman, beneath 6 feet of dirt, still breathing. By April 2011, Calvin Barrow stood in front of a bank manager in downtown Macon with a death certificate in one hand and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. The paperwork had gone through faster than anyone expected. No body was recovered. No foul play was suspected. No cause of death could be confirmed, but none could be denied either. The sheriff's report read, presumed deceased. It was enough. Enough for the insurance company to approve the payout. Enough for Calvin to collect $1.2 million in life insurance from a woman whose name was still painted across the mailbox of a home he no longer visited. He signed the release forms, thanked the man behind the glass, and walked out of that bank without looking back. The grieving husband narrative suited him. He played it with precision. No theatrics, no over-explaining. He spoke softly in public, answered questions with scripture, and reminded people that suffering was part of the calling. He told the church that God gives and God takes. He thanked them for their prayers, told them he needed time to heal, and that he'd be returning to ministry soon. What they didn't know was that he'd already started rebuilding his life in another city with another woman, and that everything Diane left behind had already been turned into capital. In May, he filed paperwork for a new nonprofit in Georgia, Kingdom Horizons Consulting. He listed it as a faith-based organization dedicated to spiritual growth, leadership development, and renewing purpose after loss. The mission statement sounded noble. The bank account attached to it was not. The entire operation was designed to legitimize the next phase of his life. A transition from the quiet widower to a respected Christian entrepreneur. On paper it looked like healing. In reality, it was business, and the first appointment he made was naming Trisha Wren as executive director. Trisha wasn't surprised. She'd waited. She'd watched. And now the man who once promised her a storefront was handing her a nonprofit title, a business checking account, and a set of keys to a $400,000 home in Macon's northern suburbs. The house was bought in full, no mortgage, no lien, just a freshly painted mailbox with their new shared last name. The kitchen had marble countertops, the closets were walk-in, and parked in the driveway was a brand new 2020 Lexus, registration filed under Trisha Barrow. He told her this was the start of their God-ordained expansion. She didn't ask where the money came from. She just smiled and changed her phone number. In August 2011, 8 months after Diane vanished, Calvin and Trisha got married in a quiet courthouse ceremony in Bibb County. No guests, no announcements, no photos online. Just 2 signatures and a marriage license sealed in a manila envelope. 3 weeks later, Calvin was featured on a Christian podcast discussing overcoming personal tragedy through faith. By fall, he appeared on 2 separate church panels in Atlanta, speaking to young pastors about navigating loss and finding purpose after grief. He told them his story, how his wife had vanished during a retreat, how the pain had reshaped him, how God had broken him down just to build him back up again. The audience applauded. No one asked questions. Meanwhile, back in North Carolina, Diane's family refused to rest. Kira Stovall spent her weekends contacting investigators, sending follow-up emails, requesting updates that never arrived. Marcus Jr. drove from city to city on his off days from the trucking route, plastering updated flyers, asking if anyone had seen his mother. But time worked against them. There was no blood, no signs of struggle, no video footage, no cell signal from the lodge. The credit cards had gone cold. The case wasn't declared closed, but it might as well have been. In October 2011, Lenoir County Sheriff's Office officially reclassified the file as an active, citing a lack of physical evidence and no proof of foul play. Without a crime scene, without a confession, and without a body, there was nothing more they could do. They told the family she may have wandered into the woods, gotten lost, suffered from a breakdown. Maybe the grief had caught up to her. Kira didn't believe it. Marcus Jr. didn't say it out loud, but he knew something didn't sit right. The man who had once cried at the altar now stood behind new pulpits. The husband who had begged for search volunteers now hosted mentorship sessions on Zoom. The widower who once called Diane his angel was now signing checks for an entirely different woman, one who wore her engagement ring like a trophy and called herself blessed and highly favored in every caption. Calvin didn't run. He didn't hide. He just reinvented himself. And in the silence left behind, Diane's name faded from headlines and police logs, replaced by newer cases, fresher tragedies, louder grief. But what Calvin never considered, what he never allowed himself to believe, was that somewhere out there she was still alive. It was early March 2011, about 2 weeks after Diane was last seen. Just outside the edge of Lenoir County, in a junkyard most people passed without ever noticing, a man named Bo Lattimore was digging through scrap metal in the back lot, searching for copper to sell. He was 58, homeless, known by most in town as harmless, quiet, always minding his business. But that morning something stopped him. Something quiet. Something he almost missed. It was a faint thudding sound, irregular, soft, barely enough to draw attention. At first he thought it was wind hitting the metal fencing, but the noise didn't stop. It came again, and again, then silence. Bo walked deeper into the debris, toward a pile of discarded wood and broken shelving, until he spotted a partially collapsed cardboard box wedged between a rusted generator and an old appliance. It was oversized, sealed with duct tape across the sides, and dented near the top. One corner had been crushed, but there were holes poked through the sides, small, uneven circles that didn't look accidental. He kicked the box lightly. Nothing. Then again. Something inside shifted, a sound like shallow breathing. Then 3 knocks, soft but real. He ran. Bo didn't have a phone, but he ran 3 blocks down to the scrapyard owner, yelling until the man followed him back. When they returned, the sound had stopped. The box was still. The owner hesitated, then ripped through the tape, peeled the top open, and stepped back in shock. Inside was a woman barely moving, soaked in sweat, pale, lips cracked, wrists bound, mouth covered in bloodied tape that had nearly fallen loose. Her eyes were open but unfocused, blinking slowly, as if she couldn't tell whether what she was seeing was real. An ambulance arrived 8 minutes later. She was rushed to Duke Medical Center, unconscious before they pulled out of the parking lot. Her core temperature was dropping. Her breathing was shallow. She was dehydrated, starved of oxygen, and suffering from what doctors later described as near-lethal hypoxia. Her brain deprived of air just long enough to survive, but not long enough to remember. She had no ID, no fingerprints in any national database, and no verbal clarity. She couldn't answer questions. She couldn't tell them her name. When the nurse asked who she was, she simply stared at the ceiling and whispered something they couldn't understand. Hospital staff labeled her Jane Doe 173B. She stayed in the ICU for 6 days, then in a recovery ward for another month, monitored around the clock, speech slow, hands trembling, unable to hold a spoon without help. CT scans confirmed damage to the temporal lobe, responsible for memory. Her motor skills returned first, followed by basic language, but her identity remained lost. No family showed up. No missing persons reports in North Carolina. Or Georgia matched her face. The flyer for Diane Stovall had been taken down weeks earlier. The police had closed her file as inactive. There was no connection. No flag. She was just another forgotten woman found too late, too broken to explain where she'd come from, and too traumatized to ask. By June, the hospital transferred her to a long-term care facility for trauma victims in Charlotte under state protection. The intake staff gave her a name, Lila, a soft name they thought she'd like. No last name, just Lila. She didn't object. She didn't say anything. For 7 months, she moved through recovery in silence, relearning how to hold a cup, how to walk across a hallway without losing balance, how to speak sentences that didn't collapse mid-thought. Therapists noted she was gentle, compliant, nonviolent. She startled at loud voices and flinched when men entered the room. She didn't sleep through the night. Every few hours, she would wake up gasping, fingers clenched, eyes wide trying to breathe. But every time someone asked what the dream was about, she said the same thing. I don't know. The doctors said she was lucky. But what they didn't understand, what no chart could measure, was that survival doesn't always feel like a blessing. Sometimes it just feels like the silence between screams. By the end of 2011, her chart was updated. Functional nonverbal trauma survivor with dissociative amnesia. She was stable, quiet, a mystery. The staff treated her well. One nurse taught her how to garden. She found comfort in the greenhouse out back, watering plants, trimming herbs, brushing soil from her fingers without needing to speak. They gave her chores and she accepted them. They gave her space and she stayed there. For nearly a decade, Diane, now Lila, existed in that quiet corner of Charlotte. She was never claimed, never identified, never reported again. She didn't ask questions. She didn't resist. She simply adjusted. And while the rest of the world forgot she ever existed, she watched the seasons change through greenhouse glass, wondering, somewhere deep inside, why her hands remembered certain things her mind did not. From 2012 to 2020, she lived as someone else. A woman without a past. A woman with no voice in the world that once called her mother, wife, teacher. But fragments come when you least expect them. And some memories, no matter how long they've been buried, don't stay buried forever. It happened on a Sunday morning in early 2020. The facility always played televised sermons in the common room on weekends. Most of the residents sat through them silently. Some nodded off. Others barely listened. But that day, the voice that came through the screen did something different. It didn't preach. It reached. It struck somewhere in the back of Diane's mind. A place she didn't know was still listening. It wasn't the words. It was the rhythm, the pacing, the smooth pauses between scriptures. The way he lifted his voice at the end of each line like punctuation disguised as praise. She froze. She didn't blink. She didn't speak at first. Just watched the man on the television, his sharp suit, his clean voice, the congregation shouting amen on cue. He quoted Proverbs. He gave an example about trust and betrayal. Then he smiled, and her stomach turned. Her hands clenched. Her mouth opened slowly, barely above a whisper, and she said to the nurse standing beside her, "I know that man." The nurse looked at her, then at the screen. "Is he from your old church?" she asked. Diane didn't answer. She just stood up and walked out of the room. Slowly, quietly, like someone moving through a dream they didn't choose. That night she didn't sleep, and the next morning she asked for a tablet. They let some of the residents borrow one if they wanted to look up devotionals or play puzzles. She said she wanted to listen to more sermons. For the next 3 weeks, she watched every single video connected to the name Pastor Calvin Barrow. From podcasts to live streams to conference clips, she sat in the corner of the rec room, headphones in, eyes locked to the screen, face unreadable. The more she watched, the more her body began to remember what her mind still couldn't name. The way he moved his hands when he spoke. The way he smiled with no teeth. The way he pronounced her favorite scripture like it belonged to him. He hadn't changed. He looked older, heavier, but the voice was exactly the same. That voice had once read her scripture beside a fireplace. That voice had once whispered over a cup of tea. That voice had prayed with her, then tried to bury her. She didn't tell the staff what she was watching. She didn't write down any notes. But every night after lights out, she would replay his sermons in her head. Each time, something came back. A flash of the lodge, the smell of wood, the weight of the duct tape on her mouth, her wrists tied, the sound of dirt hitting the box. By the second month, she stopped flinching when she remembered. She started following his new organization, Kingdom Horizons. She found their website, saw his face on the About page, standing next to a woman she didn't recognize. The caption said, Pastor Calvin and First Lady Trisha Barrow. There were photos of charity work, couples retreats, business panels. But the more she looked, the more she saw the cracks. He was performing. Again. And this time she wasn't blind to it. She didn't call her children. She hadn't spoken to Kira or Marcus in almost a decade. And now she wasn't sure if they would believe her. She didn't call the police. She knew what they would ask. She knew they would want dates, evidence, and proof that her mind hadn't played tricks. She had none of that. Just fragments. But those fragments were enough. Instead, she waited. She signed herself out of the facility 2 weeks later under her state-approved pseudonym. She said she had family in Georgia. No one checked. She used her disability stipend to rent a room in a boarding house in Macon. Small, clean, quiet. 15 minutes from the church where Calvin now preached every second Sunday. She bought a notebook and a voice recorder from a discount store. She began taking walks near his office. She watched his car. She timed his lunch breaks. She memorized the sound of his voice all over again. But this time she recorded it. She wasn't the same woman he left in that box. She was slower now. Her hands shook when she wrote. She sometimes forgot what she came to the store for, but the fire in her chest burned steady. This time, she didn't want revenge. She didn't want a headline. She wanted truth. Not whispered behind closed doors, but out loud, public, with his voice on tape. And so she watched for months, quietly, consistently, patiently, as he preached, as he posed for photos, as he handed out backpacks at youth drives and led couples in prayer. He didn't know she was there, but she was. In the back of the crowd, in the corner of the parking lot, in the store where he bought his suits. And every time he smiled for the camera, she whispered to herself the same thing. He thought I was gone. She wasn't planning an attack. She was planning a conversation, and she was waiting for the moment he would have to listen. It was June 14th, 2021, just after 9 p.m. The streets of Macon were quiet except for the steady hum of rainfall hitting gutters and porches. The kind of rain that makes everything slow down. Diane walked alone, soaked from head to toe, her coat clinging to her arms, her shoes heavy with water. She had no umbrella, no plan to turn back. For 4 miles she walked past gas stations, closed storefronts, and rows of quiet homes. Her hands steady, her heart beat louder than the storm. In her pocket was a cheap digital voice recorder. In her mind, a sentence she had waited 10 years to speak. The house was the same, a corner lot, clean white siding, trimmed hedges, a porch light glowing like nothing had ever gone wrong inside, a fresh SUV parked in the driveway, curtains drawn, a wind chime clicking slowly above the door. She stood at the steps for almost a minute before lifting her hand to knock. 3 times. Slow, solid, final. Inside, Calvin Barrow had just finished washing dishes. The television was on low in the living room. His wife, Tricia, was upstairs getting ready for bed. He wiped his hands with a towel, walked to the door casually expecting a neighbor, or maybe a church member with an emergency prayer request. He never imagined what was waiting on the other side. He opened it and froze. There she was, Diane, older, soaked, thinner than he remembered, but standing, breathing, looking him in the face. Her hair matted from the rain, her eyes dry, her posture straight. For the first 3 seconds he couldn't speak. He couldn't move. He didn't even blink. She didn't say anything at first. She let the silence do its work. Then she leaned in slightly, voice calm, steady, sharp as cut glass. Hello, Pastor. Do you still bear your mistakes? Calvin's mouth opened, but nothing came out. His lips parted like he wanted to ask if it was really her, if he was seeing things. But his body already knew the answer. His hands trembled slightly. His throat clicked as he swallowed hard, but she didn't give him time. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the recorder. No threat. No shouting. Just a cold piece of plastic and her thumb on the record button. I know what you did, she said. You have 10 minutes to tell me everything, or I tell the world. His eyes darted to the street, then back to her. His body was blocking the door, but she didn't try to step in. She didn't have to. Her presence said enough. His silence confirmed the rest. For the first time in his adult life, Pastor Calvin Barrow had no script. She waited. The rain kept falling. The recorder blinked red. His chest rose and felt like he'd been running. She tilted her head just slightly, the way she used to when he quoted scripture with double meaning. He whispered how, but she didn't answer. She didn't need to. He knew exactly how. He stepped back into the doorway and looked over his shoulder like someone might be watching. Then he stepped out onto the porch, closed the door behind him, and sat on the bench under the awning. Diane followed slowly. She didn't sit. She stood. He looked up at her like a man looking at a gravestone with his own name on it. She said, 10 years. I remembered everything. Every second. The box. The dirt. Your voice. He thought I wouldn't come back. But I did. She pressed play. And then the truth started coming out. Not all at once. Not in order. But in fragments. The kind that only a guilty man could piece together. He said he didn't mean for it to go that far. He said he thought she wouldn't suffer. He said he panicked. He said he wasn't the same man anymore. He blamed fear. He blamed pressure. He blamed Trisha. He cried. Not for her. For himself. And she recorded every word. When he finished, she didn't respond. She didn't threaten. She just turned off the recorder and looked him in the eye one last time. Then she turned around and walked back down the steps into the rain. She didn't tell him where she was going. She didn't say what she'd do with the recording. She just left him sitting there. Wet. Shaken. Empty. He sat there for nearly 20 minutes after she was gone. The man who once preached about deliverance now sat beneath his porch light. Alone. Waiting for something to save him. But no one came. By the start of 2022, the law still saw Diane Stovall's case as unresolved. No official death. No official crime. No missing person in the system because, technically, she wasn't missing anymore. And without a body, without physical evidence from that night in Lenore County, and without a formal complaint filed by the victim, no district attorney was willing to touch it. As far as the court system was concerned, whatever happened between Diane and Calvin was too old, too incomplete, too vague to prosecute. They called it circumstantial. They called it a dead end. But Diane never planned to go through the courts. She didn't want to sit through a trial where strangers picked apart her memory. She didn't want to explain why she never reported it sooner, or how she remembered some things but not others. She didn't want to answer questions about her mental health or her years living as someone else. She knew the truth. Calvin knew the truth. And now she had it recorded. So she released it. Not all at once. Not with a press conference or a lawsuit. Quietly. Carefully. Over time. She created an anonymous blog under the name The Woman in the Box. With no photos, no names, just audio clips. Short ones. Each clip no more than 5 minutes. Just enough to let people hear his voice. The fear in it. The guilt. The lies unraveling in real time. She didn't edit them. She didn't add commentary. She let the words speak for themselves. By March, the blog had over 200,000 hits. Church members recognized the voice. Former associates reposted the clips. A few small Christian watchdog sites picked it up. Then local radio. Whispers became questions. The YouTube sermons stopped. The donation links went dead. Pastors who once invited Calvin to speak began pulling his name from event flyers. His inbox filled with silence. Within weeks, Kingdom Horizons Consulting filed for administrative dissolution after a tax notice was ignored. Their office closed its doors. The website vanished. Trisha Wren changed her last name back and quietly filed for divorce. She moved out of the house and into a rental condo outside Augusta. She didn't speak publicly, but her absence was loud enough. Calvin stopped preaching. He stopped showing up to the barbershop. Stopped attending the Wednesday men's prayer group he once led. He was no longer invited to community breakfasts, funerals, or fundraisers. His face was familiar now, but not for the reasons he wanted. Even those who didn't know the full story could sense something had cracked beneath the surface. They didn't ask him why. They just stopped looking him in the eye. He tried to rebuild. Started offering private coaching sessions under a new name. Pushed inspirational quotes on a new Instagram account with no followers. But the clicks never came. The respect was gone. His story, once polished and rehearsed, had finally collapsed under its own weight. And Diane? She didn't celebrate. She didn't show her face. She didn't speak publicly, but every month, she updated the blog with another entry. Not just audio, thoughts, observations, questions she had asked herself in the dark, questions she knew other women were probably asking now. She never named him, but everyone knew who it was. She was giving the world the confession the courts never got. And in doing so, she took back something he had tried to bury forever. Her voice. He had stripped her of everything. Her body. Her memory. Her safety. Her name. But in the end, she took something from him too. His future. Because the justice system may not have moved. But the truth did. And it moved faster than he ever expected. She didn't return to seek revenge. She came back to show the world what had been hidden in plain sight. She didn't need a courtroom. She didn't need a judge. She didn't need a headline. Her existence alone was the verdict. Her voice. The sentence. Because some crimes don't end with flashing lights or mugshots. Some crimes end when the lie is dragged into daylight and made to stand still. Some crimes end when the truth no longer asks for permission to be heard. Diane didn't come back to punish him. She came back to expose him. Because when the justice system fails, sometimes the truth becomes its own weapon. What would you do if someone tried to erase you from the world and failed? Story April 2nd, 2021. She walked in through the upstairs hallway quiet, unannounced, expecting silence, but what she heard was laughter low, giggling then a moan. She opened the door and found her husband of 19 years, naked, sweating and having a threesome with her 2 teenage daughters. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she just turned around, walked downstairs and grabbed the kitchen shears. And what happened next shattered a quiet Texas neighborhood forever. Because the question isn't just what she saw, it's how long she'd been watching signs and how far a mother would go to protect what was left of her daughters. Would you have done the same? Latasha Monique Sorrell grew up just outside Waco, Texas, the youngest of 5 in a 2-bedroom house where the kitchen doubled as a homework station and the bathtub held laundry more often than water. Her mother Bernadette worked back-to-back shifts as a home health aide. Her father was gone before she turned 7. Responsibility for Latasha didn't come in seasons. It came early and stayed. She was the quiet one, the kind who knew when to speak, when to stay silent, and how to read a room before she ever stepped into it. She learned to braid her own hair by 4th grade, learned how to stretch groceries by middle school, and by high school she was caring for her sister's infant son while juggling AP classes and 2 part-time jobs. She didn't complain, she didn't cry much either. She just handled things. She didn't party, didn't chase after attention. She kept her clothes modest and her voice calm. She was the girl other girls called when they needed help figuring out their FAFSA, when they needed a ride home, when they didn't want to go into labor alone. Everyone trusted her, maybe because she never asked for anything back. After graduating in 1999, she couldn't afford a university, but she took CNA classes at the local community college and got certified by the time she turned 20. Caregiving came naturally. She knew how to hold people's pain without making them feel pitied. She worked in nursing homes, hospice units, pediatric rehab, anywhere they needed gentle hands and steady nerves. Patients remembered her name long after she left. Family sent holiday cards for years. She didn't chase titles. She wasn't interested in climbing ladders. What mattered to her was people showing up, being present, doing right by others. That was her core. By her late 20s, she had settled into life in Dallas County, picking up extra shifts and helping out at the elementary school where her nieces were enrolled. Staff noticed her warmth. Kids felt safe around her, even the ones that didn't talk to anyone else. She eventually took a part-time role as a school secretary, just for the consistent hours and health benefits. It didn't pay much, but Latasha had never measured her life in dollars. She volunteered at church, cooked for community potlucks, and kept her circle small. She didn't date often, said she wasn't interested in games or trying to raise a grown man. If you've been watching this story unfold, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from, city, state, or country. Your voice matters here. Let's see how far this story is reaching. Marcus Deshawn Latimer was born on October 3, 1976 in Beaumont, Texas. The only child of Pastor Ronald Latimer and Sunday school director Eloise Latimer, Marcus's life was shaped by expectation long before he had a say in it. His father preached discipline. His mother preached silence. Together, they ran their home like a ministry, structured, polished, performance-ready. From the outside, it looked like a model family. Scripture on the walls, matching suits on Sunday. A calendar so full of church events Marcus once joked he thought Jesus owned the lease. But inside that home, there wasn't much room for error. Marcus learned early that crying made him weak. Questioning got him punished. And obedience wasn't just requested, it was demanded. By the time he was 10, he could recite half the New Testament from memory, but struggled to look adults in the eye. He was told to smile more, speak less. Don't be soft, his father would say when he hesitated. You're a Latimer. In school, Marcus stayed under the radar. He wasn't the kid acting out in class or cutting up on the playground. He got average grades, played pee-wee football for a season before quitting, and mostly stuck to himself. Teachers described him as respectful, reserved, a little too quiet. At home, silence meant survival. His father believed in correction through force, belts, switches, whatever was close. Eloise never intervened. She'd just fold her hands and quote scripture. He who spares the rod. Marcus didn't talk about it. Not to neighbors, not to classmates, not even to himself. At 16, he got a summer job shadowing an HVAC contractor, an older man from church named Mr. Fenton. It was the first time Marcus learned that fixing something broken could earn praise instead of punishment. He was good with tools. He picked up on pressure readings, airflow, and duct diagnostics faster than most adults. For once, people noticed him for something other than being Pastor Latimer's son. He never went to college, said he didn't need a degree to work hard. Right after high school, he started working full-time under Mr. Fenton's company, then got certified by 21. By 25, he was running his own small business, Latimer Comfort Solutions. Word spread fast. He was honest, affordable, and didn't mind sweating through a 100-degree attic to fix a broken AC unit for a grandmother on a fixed income. In the Garland community, Marcus was seen as a good man. He volunteered for Habitat for Humanity, gave speeches to youth groups about trades and discipline, was invited to speak at men's breakfasts and leadership circles. He was always calm, always smiling. Type of man you'd trust to walk your mother to her car. But those closest to him, especially women, noticed something else. He didn't like being questioned, didn't like loud voices, didn't like when plans changed without his approval. There was a quiet control in everything he did. He dated a few women in his 20s, but none stuck. A former girlfriend once said, he was kind until he wasn't. But she never elaborated, just blocked his number and moved out of town. By 30, Marcus had everything he wanted, his own business, a reputation for excellence and respect from his peers. But what he lacked was intimacy, real connection. Then in 2003, he met Latasha. She was nothing like the women he had dated before, soft-spoken, careful and serious about her faith. She didn't flirt. She didn't chase. She looked him in the eye and didn't seem impressed by his charm. Marcus liked that, or maybe he liked the challenge. He called her a week later. They went for coffee after Bible study, and within 6 months, he was asking her what kind of engagement rings she liked. It was a quiet Sunday evening, October 10th, 2004, just after service ended at Calvary Baptist, and while the parking lot still echoed with laughter and the shuffle of folding chairs, Marcus asked Latasha to stay behind for a moment, saying he needed help locking up the fellowship hall, and without questioning it, as usual, she followed him inside. The room was nearly empty, the lights low, the air still holding the faint scent of potluck food, and with no flowers, no candles, and no crowd, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small white box. He didn't get on one knee, didn't give a long speech, didn't ask for a blessing or gather witnesses. He simply looked her in the eyes, calm and steady, assistant, and said, "You make me feel grounded, Tosha, like home, like peace. And I want to take care of you. I want you to be mine." Then he opened the box, revealing a single diamond on a slim gold band. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, just enough. Latasha, never one for theatrics, didn't cry, didn't gasp, didn't ask questions. She just smiled, nodded once, and said yes, because in her world, security mattered more than sparkle. And in that moment, Marcus felt like the kind of man who could carry weight without complaint. That night, she called her mother and her sisters, told them the news with a soft joy in her voice that few had heard from her in years. And they celebrated over the phone while Marcus sat quietly on the couch, saying they could tell people later that they didn't need to make it a show, and Latasha, who had never been one to demand spotlight, agreed. They set the date for the spring, started making plans that were small but meaningful, and she threw herself into it with the quiet devotion she gave everything. Booking the church hall, picking her dress early, stitching her own veil from fabric she found on sale, and through it all, Marcus stayed present, calm, cooperative. But even then there were moments. Moments when he'd go silent during planning calls, when he'd brush off her excitement, when he'd correct her softly but firmly in front of others. And though she noticed it, she brushed it off, told herself he was just tired or stressed, or simply a man who didn't fuss over details. She didn't know that this man, whose hands held hers so gently in public, was already shaping the rules she'd be expected to follow for the rest of her life. They got married on April 16, 2005. In a small church ceremony surrounded by folding chairs, sheet cake, and the kind of gospel choir harmonies that echoed deep into your chest. And while the guests clapped and the preacher smiled, Latasha walked down that aisle in a borrowed dress, believing with her whole heart that she was stepping into safety. She wore white not because it was tradition, but because it was hope, and when she placed her hand into Marcus's that morning, she did so without hesitation, without second-guessing. Without imagining that trust could someday cut as deep as betrayal. The first year was quiet. They moved into a modest rental home in Garland, just 3 bedrooms, a small fenced yard, and a fireplace that never quite worked. And she turned it into a home with the same attention she gave everything else. Folded towels in color order, labeled pantry jars, weekday meal plans that ran months in advance. Marcus worked long hours through the spring and into the sweltering Texas summer. Answering AC calls even on Sundays, and Latasha supported him the way she had been taught support should look. Hot meals, a clean house, and no questioning his schedule. At first, he was gentle, careful, doting in a way that made people say she had found a good man. A quiet man, a steady one, and Latasha wore that approval like armor. He kissed her forehead every morning before leaving for work, sent her Bible verses by text, told her she was the kind of woman men pray for, and she wanted to believe it. She needed to believe it. But slowly, subtly, the shape of the marriage changed. It wasn't arguments, it wasn't shouting, it was small corrections. He didn't like the way she folded the bath towels too tight. He didn't want the lights on after 9 p.m., wasteful. He didn't want visitors during the week. We're a married couple now, not roommates with guests. He told her he preferred she not work nights anymore, said it wasn't safe, said a man should provide. And so she adjusted. She stepped back from her overnight caregiving shifts, started a part-time role at the local elementary school, spent more time at home, started cooking more, praying more, shrinking more. She told herself that compromise was part of building something, that good wives didn't push back, they adapted. They had their first daughter, Kayla, in the spring of 2006. A warm Saturday morning. The kind of quiet day where the sunlight creeps through the hospital blinds and makes everything feel softer, calmer. Latasha labored for 11 hours, no epidural, gripping the rails of the bed with a kind of strength that came not from adrenaline, but from years of surviving without help. When Kayla finally arrived, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, pink and screaming, Latasha wept. Not loud, but the kind of cry that stays in the throat, that comes from a place deeper than relief. She held her daughter close, skin to skin, whispering promises no one else in the room could hear. Promises about safety, about never being invisible, about always being believed. Marcus came in an hour later, clean-shaven, fresh clothes, holding a stuffed bear and a phone with the camera already open. He smiled. He stood by the bed. He posted the first picture to Facebook before the nurse could even finish the newborn paperwork. Thanking God for this beautiful blessing, he captioned it, and the comments poured in. "You'll be a great dad. God knew what he was doing. She's lucky to have you both." Marcus stood in the photos, held Kayla just long enough to get a dozen angles, kissed Latasha's forehead, told her she did good. But when the nurse asked if he'd like to learn how to swaddle or change a diaper, he chuckled and said, "That's her department." The first night, when Kayla wouldn't stop crying, Latasha sat upright in the hospital bed, rocking her with one arm and holding the formula bottle in the other. Marcus snored on the pull-out chair with his back turned. He didn't stir once. When they brought Kayla home 3 days later, Latasha already had a schedule pinned to the fridge. Feeding times, sleep blocks, pumping sessions, laundry rotation. Marcus bought the crib, assembled it, and then left the rest untouched. When the baby monitor beeped at 2 a.m., it was Latasha who tiptoed across the hall, bottle ready, eyes half open. She learned how to feed with one hand, while scrolling Google for baby rashes with the other. She memorized every squeak Kayla made, every sigh, every subtle shift in her breathing. When Kayla caught her first fever at 8 weeks, Latasha wrapped her in a warm towel and sat in the urgent care lobby for 5 hours straight. She brought her own thermometer in her purse. Marcus stayed home, said he had a job the next morning, couldn't afford to lose rest. When Kayla started teething, Latasha tried everything, frozen rings, rubbing her gums with clean cloths, sitting in the rocking chair till her own lower back gave out. Marcus said she was doing too much, that babies cry. It's normal. He didn't mean it cruelly, not at first. He just didn't show up. And when Latasha brought it up, softly, carefully, asking if maybe they could take turns with the night shifts, Marcus smiled, reached for her hand and said, "Baby, you're doing it so well, I wouldn't even know what I'm doing." She wanted to believe it was a compliment. She needed to believe it wasn't neglect. So she nodded and kept going. Kayla's first steps. Latasha recorded them on her phone, while Marcus was fixing a furnace across town. Her first words, "Mama," then "Juice," then "Up." Marcus smiled when he heard them, said he'd teach her to say "Daddy" next. He never did. And yet, when it came time for the church dedication, Marcus stood tall in the front row, Kayla in his arms, matching his tie, thanking God before the congregation for the gift of fatherhood. He was praised for being present. Latasha, who hadn't slept more than 4 hours straight in over a year, just smiled. Because what else could she do? No one saw the nights. No one saw the wait. No one asked her if she was okay. And Marcus, always polite, always composed, made it easy for the world to assume everything was fine. But even in that first year, Latasha began to understand something she couldn't yet put into words. That being married to Marcus Latimer, meant carrying more than just her own load. It meant carrying his too, quietly, without asking for help, without making it look like a burden. Then came Maya in 2008, and with her came more rules. Marcus didn't want the girls wearing bright colors, too attention-seeking. He didn't like them dancing in the living room, teach his bad habits. He didn't want them sleeping in his bed ever, even during thunderstorms. And Latasha, raised on obedience and quiet suffering, complied. She told herself that boundaries were good, that structure meant stability, that maybe Marcus was just old-fashioned. And when she did question, rarely gently cautiously, he'd look at her with those unreadable eyes and say, "You don't trust me." Or worse, "You're trying to turn the girls against their father?" So she learned to swallow her concerns. She stopped asking when he'd be home. She stopped commenting when he left the dinner table to take calls in the garage. She stopped wondering why the girls tensed when he hugged them too long, or why Kayla flinched when he entered the room too quickly. She buried it under chores, scripture, and school pickups. She told herself she was overthinking. That fear was just exhaustion in disguise. And still, to the outside world, they were the picture of Christian family life. Matching dresses on Easter, backyard birthday parties with Dollar Tree decorations and hand-piped cakes. Family Bible study every Wednesday night. The girls were quiet, respectful, well-dressed. Marcus was the man who gave free HVAC repairs to single mothers. Latasha was the one who brought homemade casseroles to every church funeral. People called them blessed. But inside that house, behind the prayer journals and polished furniture, something was starting to fracture. And Latasha, though she couldn't name it yet, was beginning to feel it. Every time Maya went still when Marcus walked in the room. Every time Kayla looked over her shoulder before saying goodnight. Every time she reached for her husband in bed and felt him pull away. She didn't know it yet, but the silence that surrounded their home wasn't peace. It was a warning. It continued like this, day after day, year after year, until Kayla turned 17 and Maya 15. Both of them quiet, careful, obedient. The kind of girls who did everything right, but seemed like they were always holding their breath. They woke up early, kept their rooms clean, memorized Bible verses for youth group, and never argued, never rolled their eyes, never slammed a door. Their grades were perfect. Their clothes always ironed. Their phones barely used except for schoolwork and church group chats. And while other girls their age were posting dances or group selfies, Kayla and Maya stayed off social media entirely. Not because anyone told them to, but because they knew better. At school, teachers praised them, administrators called them model students, and the community saw them as proof that the Latimers were doing something right. People smiled when they saw Marcus at award ceremonies, shaking hands with principals and thanking God for their success. And Latasha stood beside him, clapping softly, holding her purse with both hands, nodding on cue, keeping her eyes on the girls. But at home, things were different, subtle, quiet, but undeniable. Maya started double-checking the locks on her bedroom door every night, and Kayla began spending long stretches in the bathroom with the water running. The mirror fogged up, her eyes red when she came out. Neither of them talked much at dinner anymore. When Marcus entered a room, their voices dropped, their backs straightened, and their eyes went anywhere but his face. They never said they were scared, they never asked for help, but their silence spoke louder than anything else in that house. Latasha noticed it all, the flinches, the forced smiles. The way Maya tensed at physical touch, and the way Kayla stayed up late, but always claimed she was just studying. She noticed how they avoided being alone in a room with their father, and how they leaned away when he reached out to hug them in public. She tried to ask gently, softly, in the way only a mother could. She waited until they were washing dishes or folding clothes, trying to catch them off guard, so the truth might slip out. But every time she asked if something was wrong, they looked at her with wide, tired eyes and said no, always no. And so Latasha began to pay closer attention. She started keeping track of Marcus' comings and goings, writing down the nights he lingered too long in the hallway, the afternoons he insisted on being alone in the house with the girls, the way he suddenly started locking doors and claiming it was for privacy. She kept a small black notebook in the back of the linen closet, hidden behind the detergent, filled with notes and times and questions she couldn't answer. She didn't tell anyone, not her sister, not her co-workers, not even the pastor's wife, because she wasn't sure what she was seeing yet, and Marcus had a way of turning every concern into a misunderstanding. He told her she was tired, stressed, emotional, that she was overthinking things again, that the girls were teenagers and teenagers pull away, and when she didn't agree, he'd tilt his head and ask if she was trying to make him look like a bad father, so she backed down. She always did, because for most of her life, Latasha had been taught that keeping peace meant staying quiet, and that love meant giving someone the benefit of the doubt, even when your gut begged you not to. But each day, the silence in that house grew heavier. Each night, the air felt tighter, and though she couldn't prove it, not yet, something inside Latasha was changing. She no longer believed that everything was okay. She just didn't know what to do with that belief. Yet, Latasha's instincts had never been loud. They were subtle, internal, the kind that whispered rather than screamed. But after months of sleepless nights and daughters who wouldn't meet her gaze, something inside her shifted. She started paying attention in a different way, counting how long Marcus spent upstairs, listening closely to the rhythm of footsteps in the hallway after dark, memorizing which rooms had closed doors and which ones never should. One afternoon in early February 2021, while Marcus was at work and the girls were at school, she walked through the house with a strange ache in her chest, part fear, part clarity. She opened drawers, she checked the linen closet. She stood in the hallway, eyes on the girls' doors, and felt something she couldn't explain settle in her stomach like a stone. That evening, she bought a nanny cam online, disguised as a smoke detector, motion triggered with cloud backup. She installed it quietly in the hallway, just above the light fixture. She didn't tell anyone, not even the girls. By the next morning it was gone. She came back from work and looked up, and it wasn't there. Not detached, not broken, gone. The screws were still in place, but the device had been completely removed. She didn't panic. She waited. That night, she asked Marcus casually if he had noticed anything strange about the hallway ceiling. He looked at her and blinked once, then smiled. Maybe you imagined putting it there. Those 5 words stuck with her longer than they should have. Maybe you imagined it. That phrase would repeat itself in different ways over the next few weeks. Maybe you forgot. Maybe you're just tired. Maybe it's your nerves again. Maybe it's not what it looked like. And every time she tried to bring up something, anything, Marcus would sit calmly across from her, like he was watching someone unravel. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He just made her feel small for asking. When she brought it up during a church counseling session, hoping, praying for someone to tell her she wasn't losing her mind, the response didn't surprise her. The counselor, a man Marcus had known since youth ministry, leaned back in his chair and said, "Latasha, you carry so much on your shoulders. Maybe what you need is rest." Marcus nodded in agreement, offering a soft smile and squeezing her hand. That night, she barely slept, because rest was the one thing she couldn't afford. So she started tracking things more obsessively. She wrote down the exact time Maya closed her door. She logged every time Kayla skipped breakfast. She kept notes on what clothes were missing from the laundry, which doors were locked, which lights were left on. She began taking photos of how her daughters left their rooms in the morning, then checking them again at night to see if anything had moved. She watched the girls so closely it started to scare her. She memorized the sound of their footsteps, the way their voices shifted when Marcus was near. She started asking questions out loud, but only when they weren't in the room. She found herself whispering in the laundry room, mouthing silent prayers in the pantry. Every movement, every change, every silence felt loaded. She began skipping church, stopped answering calls, told her co-workers she was under the weather. Because the idea of pretending everything was fine, standing next to Marcus in front of a congregation who thought he was God's gift to fatherhood, felt impossible. Still, the girl said nothing. Still, no one else saw it. And every time she caught a flash of fear on her daughter's face, or a nervous glance exchanged between the two of them when Marcus called from the hallway, she told herself she was imagining things. Or rather, she had been told that enough times to almost believe it. But what if she wasn't? What if that tension wasn't just in her head? What if the answers were hiding in plain sight, and she was the only one who had ever bothered to look? And what would you do if your children seemed afraid, but refused to say why? Would you trust your gut, or the man who shares your bed, your house, and your name? Because sometimes, the scariest truth isn't what's behind a locked door. It's the moment you realize you might be the only person willing to open it. Maya had always been the quiet one, the one who drew instead of spoke, the one who carried a notebook everywhere, but never let anyone read what was inside. And it wasn't until Latasha accidentally knocked it off the coffee table one morning that she saw what had been filling the pages. Short lines scribbled in pencil, unfinished sentences that didn't rhyme, but all of them heavy with something she couldn't quite name. One line kept repeating across the margins. "I'm not alone, but I feel caged." Latasha stared at it for minutes, rereading it, trying to convince herself it was just teenage angst. Just emotion, just creative expression. But something about it felt too specific, too suffocating. Kayla, once meticulous about her routines, had stopped showering every day, said it made her feel safe or not to, said she didn't want to be touched, didn't want to be exposed, and when Latasha asked why, she just shrugged, eyes down, shoulders tight. The house started to feel colder, like the silence inside it was pressing against the walls. At night, both girls began sleepwalking. Slow, confused steps down the hallway, blank stares, muttered words that made no sense. And every time Latasha found one of them standing barefoot in the kitchen, or curled in a corner with no memory of how they got there, her fear sharpened into something she could no longer pretend was exhaustion. Then came April 20th, 2021. The house was still except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint rattle of wind against the siding. And Latasha was lying in bed half asleep when she heard voices. One deep, one trembling, muffled but tense. She looked at the clock, 2:14 a.m. She sat up, listened harder, and then heard it again, Marcus saying something in a tone she hadn't heard before, followed by Kayla's voice, pleading, then silence, then footsteps, then the click of a door closing. She didn't move right away. She waited until the house fell still again. At 5:30 a.m., before anyone else was up, she walked into Kayla's room. The blanket was bunched awkwardly, the pillow slightly off-center. When she lifted it, she found a small, crushed white pill, nothing labeled, just chalky dust and fragments. She froze for a second, then swept it into a napkin, folded it 4 times, and tucked it into her pocket. She didn't cry, she didn't scream. She went downstairs, made breakfast like always, packed lunches, and waited. When Marcus came into the kitchen that morning, she asked him what happened last night. He didn't flinch, he didn't lie, he just stared at her for a long second, jaw tight, and then walked past her and slammed the back door hard enough to rattle the windows. He didn't come back for hours. That same day, she got the call from Sister James at the church, reminding her about the overnight women's retreat scheduled for April 21st, an event she'd helped organize, a weekend she'd been looking forward to, and Marcus, with sudden enthusiasm, told her she should go, said the girls would be fine, said they could use some space, said he'd take care of everything. Latasha agreed, but something inside her wouldn't rest. She packed her things, double-checked the calendar, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was being arranged around her. The next morning, Latasha left Garland just before 9 a.m., windshield wipers dragging back and forth against a misty drizzle, gospel music humming low through the speakers, and a thermos of hot tea sitting in the cup holder. The drive was supposed to be peaceful, a stretch of open road and reflection before the weekend retreat in Denton, 2 nights of rest, fellowship, and finally, a break from the tension that had been sitting on her chest for weeks. But as she crossed into rural stretches past Louisville Lake, the light rain thickened. The sky, already low, seemed to sink lower. Visibility dropped. Her hands tightened on the wheel as the road began to reflect the gray clouds overhead like a sheet of water was folding over the asphalt. Trucks slowed around her, cars flicked on their hazard lights, and the radio, once playing soft praise songs, interrupted itself with a jarring emergency alert. Flash flood warning in effect for Denton County and surrounding areas. Seek higher ground. Do not attempt to drive through flooded roads. Latasha turned the volume down and kept going. Eyes locked on the road ahead, her jaw clenched tight. Her phone vibrated twice in the console, then again, then again. Group chat messages from the retreat team were coming in back to back. Someone said they were stuck in mud, just off 377. Someone else sent a picture of water, rising around a roadside mailbox. The updates got more urgent with every mile she drove. By the time she hit Sanger, the clouds were a deep charcoal, and the rain had turned into looked like the sky was falling sideways. Visibility had shrunk to just a few feet ahead. That's when Sister James finally called. Latasha pulled off the road, tires splashing into the edge of a flooded shoulder. Her hands were trembling as she pressed the phone to her ear. Sister James didn't waste time. Baby, turn around. It's been canceled. We can't get through. The road's gone under, and the pastor's van is stuck behind a jackknife truck. It's too dangerous. Please don't keep driving. For a moment, Latasha just stared out at the windshield, where the wipers could barely keep up with the downpour. Her eyes scanned the fields, now turning into ponds, the power lines swaying, and she felt something tighten in her gut. Something more than disappointment, more than inconvenience. It was the quiet certainty that she wasn't supposed to be at the retreat this weekend. She turned the car around slowly, carefully, steering through waterlogged dips and branches swept into the road, and started heading back toward Garland. She didn't call home. She didn't say she was returning. She just drove. And as she watched the sky above her churn and the storm begin to follow her back toward Ridgepoint Drive, she couldn't shake the feeling that the cancellation wasn't just weather. It was timing, and it was already too late. The windshield wipers clicked slowly as she turned down Ridgepoint Drive at exactly 5:47 p.m., and the house looked the same from the outside. Porch light off, curtains still drawn, Marcus' work truck parked just slightly crooked. She sat in the car for a moment longer than usual, watching the windows, listening to the silence, then grabbed her bag and walked toward the front door without making a sound. She unlocked it, stepped inside, and everything felt off. There was no smell of dinner, no sound of TV. Just a strange quiet, thick and unnatural. The kind that wraps around your chest and won't let go. She kicked off her shoes, set her keys on the table, and made her way upstairs slowly barefoot, careful not to let the floorboards creak beneath her. Halfway up the stairs, she heard something. Laughter. Breathing. Not playful. Not joyful. Just wrong. She paused. Listened again, her heart beating in her throat. Then she said it, quiet, like she didn't want to hear the answer. "What are y'all doing in there?" No one replied. Not a sound. She reached the landing, her hand resting against the wall, her eyes fixed on the bedroom door that stood just slightly ajar, and for a moment she couldn't move. Then she pushed it open, and for a moment, her body froze as her eyes locked onto a scene that her mind refused to process. Marcus was in bed, completely nude, flanked by their 2 daughters under the influence, dazed and visibly afraid. Marcus moved first, his voice breaking as he said, "This isn't what you think." But Latasha didn't wait to hear the rest, didn't argue, didn't scream. She turned and ran. What would you do if you found your husband molesting the girls he called daughters? She bolted down the stairs, her breath sharp and shallow, her hands shaking so badly she missed the first step on the way down. And when she reached the kitchen, her eyes scanned the countertop with a kind of clarity that only exists in moments of absolute certainty. She grabbed the black-handled kitchen shears from the butcher block, the heavy ones she used for bones and thick packaging, and gripped them so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She didn't pause. She didn't plan. She walked back up the stairs like a woman who already knew what had to be done. Marcus stood there in the same spot, still trying to speak, still trying to manage the moment with that familiar calm that had always silenced her before, but she didn't care about explanations anymore. She raised the shears and lunged without hesitation, and the first slice sent him into a howl so loud the neighbors heard it through the walls. The second made him collapse to his knees, hands flailing, blood already pooling on the floor, and by the third, he stopped screaming and started choking on the pain. The shears clattered to the floor beside him, and Latasha backed away, her chest heaving, her dress soaked from the waist down, her hands shaking but steady enough to open the door and walk out of the room. The 911 call came in at 06:03 p.m. from the neighbor next door, who told the dispatcher he heard screaming, that something horrible was happening, and that someone was definitely hurt. Officers arrived within minutes, expecting chaos, maybe a domestic argument or a stabbing, but what they found stopped them in their tracks. Marcus Latimer curled up in a pool of blood on the floor of his bedroom, naked, whimpering, barely conscious, and struggling to hold what remained of himself together. Kayla sat just outside the doorway wrapped in a sheet, her eyes fixed on the carpet, while Maya lay beside her, curled into a ball, silent and unmoving. Neither girl said a word. Neither looked up, neither seemed fully aware of where they were. Paramedics arrived at 6:17 p.m. and took the girls away in separate ambulances, each strapped to a gurney, each sedated within minutes after becoming visibly distressed. Marcus was lifted onto a stretcher with a compress between his legs, the EMTs whispering to one another with looks they didn't know how to mask. Latasha was still on the porch when the officers approached her. She didn't fight. She didn't explain. She stood up slowly, stained red, eyes hollow, and whispered once more he broke them. I broke him. The arrest happened quietly. Inside the house, investigators worked through the night, evidence bags filled with clothing, prescription bottles, cameras, bedding. The hallway where the girls had once tiptoed in silence was now filled with the clicks of boots and flashes of police cameras. The walls that once held in secrets had been opened, and what spilled out was worse than anyone had imagined. Marcus survived. Doctors reconstructed what they could. He was placed under protective medical custody and sedated for 2 days straight. After her arrest, Latasha sat in the small gray interrogation room without moving for nearly 6 hours, her hands resting on the table, her eyes fixed forward, her face unreadable, and despite the rotating presence of detectives who tried everything from casual conversation to direct confrontation, she didn't respond, didn't cry, didn't ask why she was there, and didn't show any signs of fear or panic. They brought her water, offered her a break, told her it was better to talk now than later. But she remained silent until finally, without looking up, without blinking, without changing her tone, she said 5 words that stopped the entire room cold. "I saw what I saw." They asked what she meant, asked her to explain, asked her to start from the beginning, but she didn't add anything, didn't adjust her posture, didn't give them a story they could write down, and the detectives later described her as alert and emotionally distant, but entirely stable. Not rambling, not irrational, just locked inside something too large for words. They said she wasn't confused, she wasn't scared, she wasn't angry, she was finished. While Natasha remained in custody, and Maya were transported under police escort to a trauma center, where 2 separate teams of child psychologists waited to begin forensic interviews. And though both girls were quiet at first, withdrawn, and slow to speak, Maya eventually opened up, her voice shaking, her eyes barely meeting the doctor's, saying that it started when she was 9, saying he would wait until the house was quiet, saying he would sit on the edge of her bed and whisper that this was how fathers showed love, that this was their secret, that this was normal. She said he made her take pills sometimes, small white ones that made her sleepy, and when she woke up, she didn't always remember everything, but she remembered enough. Kayla's interview came next. She said Marcus started with words, then touches, then instructions. And she said that whenever they tried to pull away or refuse, he would remind them that their mother was fragile, that she wouldn't believe them, that if they ever told anyone, she would die or be taken away, and everything they knew would disappear. She said that after a while, it just became something they lived with. Toxicology reports later confirmed that both girls had trace amounts of diphenhydramine and low-dose lorazepam in their systems, over-the-counter and prescription medications used to sedate or reduce anxiety. Levels low enough to avoid suspicion in routine exams, but high enough to impair memory and awareness in adolescence. As investigators continued digging into Marcus Latimer's past, a different picture of the man began to emerge. A foster sister from his teenage years in Beaumont had filed a complaint with CPS in 1991, saying he had touched her while they shared a room during a family trip, and although the complaint had been closed due to lack of physical evidence and Marcus was never formally charged, the case file still existed in the archives, buried in a stack labeled unsubstantiated. More evidence surfaced when detectives searched his work phone and recovered encrypted backups, which included text exchanges between Marcus and Kayla that dated back as far as 2019. And while the messages never included outright admissions, they were disturbing. Phrases like "this stays between us," "you know I wouldn't hurt you," and "let's not talk about that anymore, just act normal." The most damning discovery came from inside his phone case. Behind a plastic flap tucked beneath the inner shell of the device, investigators found a micro SD card, and on it were dozens of silent video clips labeled with generic dates, each showing blurry but unmistakable footage from what appeared to be a hidden camera placed inside the girls' shared bathroom vent. The clips had been captured over a period of at least 13 months. The footage was enough to confirm premeditation, surveillance, and a pattern of grooming and control that now extended beyond the abuse itself. Meanwhile, forensic experts confirmed that the injury Marcus sustained was a complete amputation, clean but forceful, consistent with a blade like the heavy kitchen shears recovered at the scene, and when pathologists examined the cut marks, they determined it was not the result of random violence or unplanned panic, but rather a controlled, high-impact, deliberate action delivered in a single continuous motion. And there were no signs of hesitation or struggle on Latasha's part. No defensive wounds on Marcus, no scratches, no bruises, which suggested he hadn't seen it coming. There were no online searches from Latasha's phone about revenge or dismemberment, no diary entries about planning, no conversations or text threads with friends that hinted at rage. There was only one entry in her black notebook, dated April 20th, the day before the incident, where she had written 5 words and circled them twice. "Kayla isn't safe, neither is Maya." The public reaction spread like fire across the country. Talk radio exploded with debate. Opinion pieces flooded local and national outlets. On cable news, talking heads argued over whether Latasha Latimer was a hero or a criminal. And in front of the Dallas County Courthouse, protesters gathered in waves, some holding signs that read, "Free Latasha and Believe Black Mothers," while others stood across the street calling for prosecution, claiming that no matter the circumstances, no one had the right to take the law into their own hands. Social media turned into a battleground, hashtags like Number Justice for Laetitia and Number Hebrokeem climbing into trending charts overnight. Anonymous threats were called into the DA office, voicemails warning the prosecutor not to pursue charges, emails filled with outrage from women across the country who said they had seen the same signs and stayed silent too long. One email read, "You failed those girls." She didn't. The community was divided, the city under pressure, and the courtroom was already becoming the stage for something larger than one act of violence. It was becoming a trial about silence, protection, belief, and the cost of trusting the wrong man. And through it all, Latasha said nothing more than what she had said on the porch, in the back seat of the patrol car, in the interrogation room, and in the intake cell where she now sat waiting for formal charges to be filed. He broke them. I broke him. The trial began on November 1st, 2021, inside a packed courtroom in downtown Dallas, where every seat was filled and reporters lined the back wall, their notepads resting on their knees, their phones recording everything from jury selection to opening statements. And outside the courthouse, a growing crowd of supporters, protesters, and curious onlookers stood shoulder to shoulder beneath heavy skies as sheriff's deputies formed a perimeter around the steps. Latasha was charged with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, a felony that carried the possibility of 20 years behind bars, and the state argued that while her motive may have been emotional, the act itself was intentional and violent. The defense did not deny what she had done. They didn't have to. Instead, they focused on what led up to it, on the years of silent abuse, on the psychological pressure that built over time. On the night of April 21st, when a mother walked in on something that shattered every rule of human decency, they entered a plea of temporary insanity under severe emotional provocation, backed by clinical assessments and Latasha's complete psychological workup. And when they delivered their opening statement, they didn't begin with justification. They began with the question, what would you have done if it was your child? The testimony from Kayla and Maya was scheduled for the third day of trial, and the court cleared the room of non-essential personnel to preserve their privacy. But even behind closed doors, the weight of their words left a permanent scar on everyone present. Maya took the stand first. She answered 4 questions before her hands began to shake and her voice broke. And when the prosecutor asked her to describe one of the incidents from her childhood, she closed her eyes and fainted mid-sentence, collapsing into the arms of the attending officer and being carried out on a stretcher while the room sat frozen in silence. Kayla testified the following morning. She sat upright, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her voice thin but steady, and when asked how long the abuse had gone on, she said, "Long enough for me to think it was normal." And when asked what happened the night of the mutilation, she didn't flinch, didn't stutter. She just said, "He stole our voices." She gave them back. Then came Marcus. He entered the courtroom in a wheelchair, pushed by a court-appointed nurse, his head lowered, his face clean-shaven, his hands folded across his lap. His attorney guided the questions carefully, building the narrative that Latasha was emotionally unstable, controlling, jealous, and obsessed with the idea that he was too close to the girls. He claimed she had a history of paranoia. He claimed the girls made things up to get attention. He said he had no idea why she would attack him so violently. But the jury didn't look at him the same way they looked at her. They didn't respond to his words with curiosity. They responded with caution. A clinical psychologist brought in by the defense testified that Latasha exhibited clear symptoms of trauma-induced dissociation, describing how her mind had likely separated itself from reality in the moment of discovery, how her emotional collapse had been building slowly over years of subtle psychological abuse, isolation, and maternal fear. Another expert, a former forensic psychiatrist for the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, stated plainly that no rational mother could have stayed silent under those circumstances. They didn't present her as a hero. They presented her as a woman who had lost everything and still chose to fight for what was left. After 6 weeks of testimony, 47 exhibits, and 15 witnesses, the jury returned on December 14, 2021, just after 3 p.m. The courtroom sat in complete silence as the 4 persons stood and read the verdict, not guilty of attempted murder. But she was found guilty on a lesser charge, reckless bodily harm under emotional duress. Rarely used provision in Texas law that allowed for the consideration of psychological trauma as a mitigating factor in violent acts. The judge, after reviewing her psychological evaluation, and the unanimous recommendation from the Mental Health Board sentenced her to 18 months in a residential psychiatric rehabilitation center. There would be no prison time. She would be monitored. She would receive treatment. She would not be allowed to return home. The courtroom was quiet. There was no cheering. There were no tears, only breath long, slow and collective. But the final decision came with a cost. In the last 10 minutes of the hearing, Child Protective Services presented their findings. Due to the extent of trauma the girls had experienced and the psychological distress triggered by witnessing both the abuse and the mutilation, the court ruled that Kayla and Maya would remain in protective custody. Latasha would not be allowed any contact, not until she completed her program, not until she passed a full psychological clearance, and not until a family court judge deemed it safe for them to reunite. She didn't protest. She didn't ask for mercy. She simply stood as the bailiff approached and turned toward the doors, hands cuffed loosely at the wrist, eyes forward, her daughters behind her, her name now echoing across headlines and court records alike. And as the doors closed behind her, one truth remained. She hadn't just broken the silence. She had broken the cycle. But the cost was everything else. Latasha spent her first 3 days inside the psychiatric facility without saying a single word to anyone, not to the intake nurse, not to the counselor assigned to her wing, not even during meals, where she sat with her hands folded and her eyes fixed on the clock, counting minutes like she was waiting for something that never arrived. The facility, tucked just outside Fort Worth, was quiet but structured, with daily group sessions, individualized therapy, weekly medication assessments, and journal exercises handed out every evening before lights out. And while most residents resisted or forgot or scribbled meaningless words just to pass inspection, Latasha wrote with the same controlled intensity she had once used to fold laundry and track her daughter's movements. She wrote in complete sentences, full pages, no crossed-out lines, and every night she filled a fresh notebook with thoughts she never said out loud. Doctors described her as stable, not withdrawn, but disciplined. Someone who followed the rules without pushback, but kept a kind of emotional distance that made it hard to read her progress. And during her third evaluation, one of the attending psychiatrists noted that she was lucid, attentive, fully aware of her surroundings, and mentally coherent in all categories, but then paused and added quietly, "But grief runs deeper than logic, and her grief hasn't spoken yet." She remained in treatment through the winter, attending every session, completing every assignment, answering every question with honest but measured responses. And yet still, no calls were allowed, no visits were approved, and every photo of her daughters had been removed from her personal space by court order until clearance could be granted. Meanwhile, Marcus had left Texas. Shortly after his release from the hospital, he relocated to Arizona under a new name, legally castrated, permanently disabled, and medically reliant on a rotation of private caregivers. His siblings, once supportive, publicly cut ties after reading the full forensic file released by the court. 2 brothers issued a joint statement disavowing all contact. His only remaining relative, a cousin in Nevada, refused to comment. He became a recluse. The HVAC business he once ran quietly dissolved. The church that had once praised his character replaced the pews where he once sat with new seating, new leadership, and a deliberate silence about his past. In March of 2022, just weeks before the anniversary of the incident, a new lawsuit was filed in civil court by a woman in San Antonio who claimed Marcus had groomed and assaulted her when she was 16 during a church youth retreat in 2003. Her file included old text messages, a journal entry, and an affidavit signed by 2 former volunteers. The case is still pending. Latasha didn't follow the news. She didn't ask about his whereabouts. She spent most of her mornings alone in the East Garden behind the facility. Seated on the same bench, her notebook opened, her pen always moving. She wasn't trying to get out. She was trying to find herself. Then came April 21st, 2022, exactly 1 year after that night on Ridge Point Drive. The morning began like any other. Roll call at 7, breakfast at 7:30, group therapy at 9. But just before her one-on-one session, the unit secretary approached her with a small white envelope wrapped in clear plastic, the kind of controlled delivery they used for incoming correspondence from minors. The envelope was covered in floral print, the kind Maya used to love in middle school, and on the back, a small heart had been drawn in blue ink next to the initials ML. Latasha held it for a moment without moving. Then she opened it slowly, carefully, like she wasn't sure her hands could be trusted, and inside was a single sheet of lined notebook paper, folded 4 times, still smelling faintly of lotion and pencil shavings. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. It read, "Mom, you saved us. You weren't supposed to see it like that. We're healing. Please heal too." She read it once, then again, then folded it back the exact same way, and placed it into her journal between pages she hadn't filled yet, and for the first time in months she asked to speak to her therapist early. Later that week, staff reported that Latasha began to speak more freely during sessions. She smiled once. She joined a morning yoga group. She began eating full meals. She requested her Bible. And during a creative writing exercise in early May, she wrote a single sentence that her counselor later said she would never forget. "Forgiveness is not forgetting. It's surviving on purpose." The house on Ridge Point sat still now. No more curtains pulled halfway. No scent of jasmine from the front porch. The wind rustled through the empty yard, where the girls once played double dutch. The mailbox hung slightly open, faded notices inside untouched. It had become a place people pointed at from a distance. No one mowed the lawn anymore. No one fixed the screen door that used to slam shut every evening around dinner time. The neighbors walked their dogs on the opposite side of the street now. It wasn't just the crime that unsettled them. It was the silence that followed. Inside, the living room still held pieces of what used to be a family. Couch cushions stained from juice boxes, framed school awards with stickers peeling at the corners, a chipped cross still hanging above the archway into the hallway. But the echo in those rooms had changed. What once was laughter and television noise had been replaced by a different kind of sound, emptiness, the kind that settles after everything has been exposed. And nothing was ever what it seemed. In the quiet corners of suburbia, monsters didn't hide under beds. They stood in the kitchen making scrambled eggs. They drove the carpool van. They prayed in the front pew and held their daughter's hand in public. And sometimes they wore wedding rings. Latasha never thought she'd raise a weapon. She thought she'd raise women. She thought she'd raise peace. For years, she followed rules. She prayed. She endured. She obeyed her vows. She trusted systems. But when the system failed to see her daughters, she stopped waiting. Story 3 was a holy man, God's chosen, the voice behind the altar, the shepherd everyone trusted with their daughters, their prayers, their pain. He preached about discipline, purity, obedience, and they believed every word. His body was breaking down, skin swelling, veins darkening, flesh turning soft like something dying from the inside out. No sign of weakness, no signs of trauma, no poison in his blood, just decay spreading fast. Doctors had theories, none made sense. Because this wasn't natural, it was deliberate. And the only clue? A condom that no one could trace. How did it happen? You're about to find out. Before the tailored suits and the polished pulpit. Before the women cried at the altar and the congregation rose to their feet at the sound of his voice. He was just Daniel Keith Riggins, a quiet boy from the northern edge of East Baton Rouge Parish, Louisiana. Born March 12, 1982, in a flood-damaged community hospital. Raised on government peanut butter, scripture, and silence. His mother, Velma Riggins, never spoke much about the man who fathered him. All Daniel ever knew was that he wasn't wanted by one man, but deeply needed by one woman. And she poured everything she had into making sure he'd never feel the gap. Their house was small, 2 rooms, 1 fan, no father. Velma worked double shifts as a cafeteria worker at Glen Oaks High School, and still managed to make it to Wednesday night prayer meetings. She kept an oil-stained Bible tucked behind the flour tin, and believed in the power of discipline, fasting, and routine. Every morning by 6 a.m., Daniel was kneeling beside the edge of their twin-sized bed, reciting Proverbs by memory before walking 4 miles to school. By the time he was 10, the church had become his world. And not just any church. Mount Zion Baptist off of Angeline, where the choir was always loud and the pastor spoke like thunder. Daniel sat in the front row every Sunday. Not blinking, not fidgeting. He didn't just listen. He absorbed. The cadence. The inflections. The way Pastor Lockett gripped the mic when he said, "I feel God moving." Daniel studied all of it. People thought he was just obedient. What they didn't know was that he was rehearsing. At 13, he gave his first sermon at a youth revival in Opelousas. He preached on David and Goliath, and when he shouted, "What giant stands between you and your breakthrough?" the room erupted. Elders wept. Strangers laid hands on him. And right there, in that moment, something clicked inside him. Power. Real power. Not from fists or threats or violence, but from words. From that point on, he wasn't just the preacher's protege. He became the draw. By 15, he was invited to speak at revivals across the state. Lake Charles, Monroe, even as far as Texarkana. People didn't come to see the senior pastor anymore. They came to see that young man with the fire in his belly. Some said he was the next T.D. Jakes. Others said he was already more anointed. But Daniel wasn't interested in being the next anyone. He wanted his own name on the marquee. At 17, with nothing but a folding table and 30 plastic chairs and a rented bingo hall, he launched his first official ministry, Riggins Fire and Faith Assembly. It was unregistered, unpolished. But every Friday night people packed that tiny space to hear him scream about hell and healing. He knew how to cry on cue. He knew how to touch a woman's shoulder and call it deliverance. He had mastered the performance. By 22, he moved into a bigger space and changed the name to Spirit Tabernacle Revival Center. It sounded official. It sounded permanent. And it was. His sermons were streamed. Choirs recorded live albums. He wore robes with gold embroidery. Members sowed seeds into his mantle, buying him watches, cufflinks, a pearl white Lincoln. He began walking with security, not because he needed it, but because it made him feel set apart. He told the congregation God had called him to raise queens and restore broken vessels. Single mothers poured out their hearts to him. Teen girls confided in him. Widows brought him casseroles and whispered prayers. But there was something deeper under all that praise. A hunger that no offering plate could fill. A need for control. A craving for loyalty disguised as submission. And even then in those early days there were signs. But they were easy to miss. By 2016, Pastor Daniel Riggins was no longer just a preacher. He was a brand. His face on banners. His voice on Sunday morning radio. The front pews filled with young women taking notes not on scripture, but on his smile, his pauses, the way he said, "My queen," with a lingering softness that felt personal even when spoken to a crowd. He had perfected it. The warmth. The authority. The rhythm of reassurance that made you forget to question what wasn't being said. And for many, especially the young and searching, it worked. The first voice came in softly. A girl, barely 20, who had joined the choir looking for purpose after her father died in a car crash. He told me I reminded him of Ruth, that I carried loyalty in my bones. I didn't even know what that meant at the time. I just knew it felt good to be seen. He said I was his rib. I believed him. The relationship started with late-night texts about purpose. Then private meetings in the pastor's office. Then touches that felt holy until they didn't. By the time she realized it wasn't love, it was too late. He stopped answering. She was moved off the choir schedule, and when she tried to speak to one of the church mothers, she was told she was confused and needed prayer. In 2017, a second voice came. She was 21, a college student studying early childhood education. She joined the church after attending a youth outreach. It was her second time inside a sanctuary since her uncle molested her at age 9. She thought this would be her healing. Pastor Daniel offered her a scholarship from the Benevolence Fund. He also offered her private mentorship. He said God told him to restore what had been broken in me, that I had a softness men had tried to ruin. He used to pray over my thighs. He called it cleansing. She went to the board quietly. They told her she was misinterpreting his compassion. She left the church 3 weeks later and hasn't stepped inside one since. In 2019, a third voice, a girl who had grown up in that church, baptized by Daniel when she was 12. At 18, she was the face of the youth ministry. At 19, she was 2 months pregnant and afraid to tell anyone who the father was. He said we had to keep it secret so the vision wouldn't be attacked. He promised we'd be married before the baby came. Then I found out I wasn't the only one. She miscarried at home. Alone. Called him. He blocked her. Each story followed the same pattern. Praise. Pursuit. Isolation. Discard. And every time someone tried to speak up, they were met with the same shield. Touch not my anointed. 4 words. Use like a blade. Her name was Lydia Owens. 19 years old. Devoted. Soft-spoken. The kind of girl who still ironed her church clothes on Saturday nights and never missed Sunday school, even when her stomach hurt or her world was falling apart. She was the second daughter of Belinda Owens, a nurse who raised her daughters with scripture in the morning and gospel records playing while they cleaned. Lydia was the quiet one, the helper, the one who sang harmony without ever needing to lead. But everything shifted in November of 2018, when Belinda died suddenly from a stroke. Lydia was the one who found her, in the kitchen, still holding the broom. It broke something inside her, something too delicate to name. Her older sister Mariella was overseas at the time, finishing a tech fellowship in Toronto. So Lydia leaned into the only place she knew to go, the church, and more specifically, Pastor Daniel. He told her grief was a door, and that only he had the key. Told her spirit was rare, that her purity attracted warfare. He said it wasn't just comfort she needed, it was covering. So she entered counseling. They met every Thursday afternoon in his study. He started sending her devotionals at midnight. Started calling her daughter in public, my queen in private. Then the messages shifted. You're the only one who sees me clearly. You're God's answer to a prophet's loneliness. January 4th, 2019. He sent a voice note. God has chosen you for me. I've seen it. I've dreamed it. You're the last piece of my mantle. He slept with her. Often. Quietly. Methodically. In ways that made her believe it was holy. In ways that blurred every line between prayer and possession. To the congregation, Lydia was just another spiritual daughter. A faithful girl in the third row. Always clutching her Bible. Always dressed modestly. Always ready with a yes, Pastor. He'd place his hand on her shoulder during altar call. Speak over her life during midweek service. He'd say, God's hand is on this one. And the room would shout in agreement. But when the church lights dimmed, when the building emptied and the robes were folded away, Daniel was no shepherd. He was strategic. He never brought her to his house. That would be too obvious. Instead, he'd book out-of-town hotel rooms on Thursdays. The same days he scheduled their counseling sessions. He kept burner phones, different ones for different girls. But Lydia, she got the good phone. The one with a lock screen of a Bible verse and a folder full of hotel confirmations. He used scripture like foreplay. This is the marriage bed, undefiled. God made woman to bring man peace. The oil flows when the vessel is open. To Lydia it felt sacred. It felt chosen. He would whisper after, telling her he was fighting temptation. But God kept pulling them together for a purpose. That their union was prophetic. That every time they laid down was preparation for the day he'd make her a first lady. And so she stayed. Because when a man tells you he loves you with the authority of heaven in his voice, you stop asking questions. She'd leave those nights aching, bleeding sometimes, sitting in the back seat of a borrowed car, holding her stomach while he told her to delete the call log. And still, she'd come back the next week. Because by then, he wasn't just her pastor. He was her whole world. Her covering. Her reason. Her pain. And when she cried during worship, they thought it was the Spirit moving. But it wasn't. It was what he left behind. The bruises no one could see. The lies dressed in prophecy. The loneliness of being used in private while being called daughter in public. Every embrace at the altar felt like a performance. Every God bless you from him landed like a slap. Because she knew the hands he laid on her weren't for healing. They were for ownership. And she was losing pieces of herself every time she let him take what he never intended to keep. By March 2019, she was pregnant. They drove 3 hours to a clinic in Texarkana where he paid cash and signed the intake form using a fake last name. They didn't speak the whole ride back. She bled alone that night. No one knew. By September 2019, it happened again. This time, he said it was a test of obedience. That sacrifices always come before elevation. He quoted Abraham and Isaac, then told her to let go of the flesh for the sake of the Spirit. She went along with it. Again. But the third time, in January 2020, something went wrong. She was already weak, pale, and dizzy before they even got to the motel 2 towns over. That night, she passed out in the shower. She was rushed to the ER under the name Jessica Ward. Severe hemorrhaging. Internal tearing. Doctors said if she had waited another hour, she would have died. After that, she stopped going to choir practice. Stopped speaking in Bible study. Her voice, once so soft and kind, disappeared completely. Her friends said she stopped singing altogether. The girl who used to hum in line at the grocery store now stared blankly at her phone. She was always cold, always tired, always looking over her shoulder when Pastor Daniel walked into a room. But she still wore the promise ring he gave her, still believed in when he said, "I'm preparing our home." She believed the pain meant something, that all the silence, all the hiding, all the broken promises would one day make sense. May 10th, 2020. Mother's Day. The sanctuary was still buzzing from service. The women of the church had been honored with roses and poems. Pastor Daniel had preached a message titled, "The Womb of Glory," calling women vessels, praising mothers, declaring that every woman in this house carries heaven inside her. The crowd had stood on their feet. Tears flowed. Lydia had sung that morning. A solo. His eye is on the sparrow. Her voice shook, but no one noticed. She smiled on cue, folded the robe over her arm, waited till most had left. She was always the one to stay behind. Faithful. Dependable. That's who she was. So no one thought it odd when she went back to the vestry to return the robe rack. The hallway was quiet. The lights dimmed. Just the rustle of paper and faint echoes of post-service cleanup. Then she heard a voice. Familiar. Low. His voice. Laughing. She rounded the corner and paused at the vestry door. Ajar. There they were. Pastor Daniel Riggins. Tanya Douglas. 21, choir soloist. The same girl he introduced months ago as his niece. The one who sat close during rehearsals. The one Lydia had once prayed with during a late-night phone fast. Their hands were on each other, locked around waists, his lips against hers, his fingers brushing the same shoulder. He once anointed Lydia with oil. It wasn't just a kiss. It was casual, comfortable, practiced. She stood there for maybe 4 seconds, long enough to feel her chest tighten, long enough to understand that everything he ever told her about purpose, about covering, about covenant meant nothing. And then she didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She turned, quietly walked down the corridor, pushed open the side sanctuary door, and sat on the church steps. In the sunlight, she sat for nearly 30 minutes. No movement, no tears, no expression, just staring. Straight ahead, as if the stained glass had split wide open and exposed every lie she'd ever swallowed. From that day forward, she stopped eating. Not all at once, but bit by bit. Her appetite faded. Food made her nauseous. She'd push eggs across her plate in the morning, sip on broth and let it go cold. Someday she'd go without touching anything but water. Her jeans sagged. Her wrists thinned. Her smile disappeared. Her friends noticed. One said she looked like a shadow wearing a wig. Another said Lydia kept blinking like she was somewhere else. She stopped replying to group chats. Stopped taking calls. Her voice went flat when spoken to. Her church attendance dropped. But when she did come, she sat in the back, far from the pulpit, wrapped in a gray hoodie, 2 sizes too big, and in every room he walked into she shrank. Once during intercessory prayer, Pastor Daniel reached out to lay hands on her. She flinched, pulled away, told the usher she had to use the restroom, and never came back in. No one followed her. No one asked. The church never raised a question, never wondered how the first soprano of the choir vanished into silence. And Daniel, she died on June 4th, 2020, sometime before sunrise, in a cold hospital room without a single familiar hand holding hers. And the official cause was listed as internal bleeding, acute sepsis, and uterine rupture. But those words could never capture what actually led her there. The months of silence, the manipulation, the forced obedience disguised as love. The nurses said she arrived too late, that her blood pressure had already dropped too far, that by the time they stabilized her, infection had already spread through her bloodstream, that her eyes were glassy, her hands icy, and her body fighting for air that her lungs could no longer hold. She coded once, came back, coded again. And that was it. No last words. No one whispering scripture. No pastor pacing in prayer. When the hospital made the call, Mariella was sitting in her apartment in Houston, scrolling through work emails, not knowing that her little sister was already gone. Not knowing that the girl she used to walk to school and braid hair for and protect from bullies had taken her last breath with a stranger's name on her chart, Jessica Ward, because Daniel had taught her how to disappear even while she was still alive. They also called Spirit Tabernacle. No answer. No return call. Just a voicemail that said, "Leave a message and be blessed." 3 days later, at her memorial, Pastor Daniel stood in his full silver robe behind the same pulpit he used to whisper promises from, and told the congregation that the devil had taken Lydia before her time, that her death was spiritual warfare, that sometimes God calls his best soldiers home early to spare them greater pain. And the crowd nodded and wept and shouted amen, while the one man who could have saved her life lied into a microphone with a Bible in his hand and a grave behind him. He didn't look at her casket. He didn't mention her name more than once. He didn't offer any comfort to the family because he had already moved on. When the service ended, he hugged a few mothers, shook a few hands, and got into his white SUV like he hadn't just buried the girl he once called his rib. But that same day, 10:22 p.m., Baton Rouge Metropolitan Airport, flight from Houston, Mariella Owens stepped off the plane, carrying nothing but a duffel bag and a silence that sat like stone in her chest. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She didn't call anyone to say she was home. She just went straight to the hospital morgue, signed her name on a clipboard, and waited for them to unlock the drawer. When they pulled it out, when she saw Lydia's body, bloated gray, the shape of her mouth still slightly open, her arms folded across a chest that had once held so much hope and music and faith. Mariella didn't scream, didn't faint, didn't crumble. She just stared like time had frozen, like her brain couldn't catch up to what her eyes were seeing. And when the coroner quietly explained that her sister's uterus showed extensive trauma, likely from repeated injuries that had never fully healed, Mariella didn't ask for more detail because she already knew what it meant. She didn't need to be told how this happened. She already had the answer. And in that moment, something inside her calcified, grief curling into a slow, deliberate rage that didn't scream or lash out, but simply made a promise to itself. She would go to that church. She would wear the dresses, learn the language, smile the smile, clap at the sermons. She would become exactly the kind of woman Daniel looked for. And when the time was right, when he thought he had won again, when he thought no one would ever make him pay, she would take everything from him the same way he took her sister. Piece by piece, from the inside, Mariella Owens had always been the logical one, raised on formulas, code, and quiet resolve. She was the type of girl who solved puzzles upside down, who taught herself to write in Python at 14, who graduated top of her class at Southern University, and got recruited into a federal research contract before she even turned 23. She believed in proof, not prophecy. She respected structure, not sermons. And while Lydia clung to scripture and Sunday traditions, Mariella found her peace in hard data and silence. Church, to her, was theater, a performance built on guilt and charisma. She never hated it. She just never trusted it. But Lydia did. Lydia trusted with her whole chest. She worshipped with both hands lifted. And when she died without a voice, without dignity, without even her real name on a hospital chart, Mariella realized that truth alone wouldn't bring justice. She'd have to become the very illusion she'd always rejected. So in July of 2020, Mariella packed up her Houston apartment. She deleted every trace of her digital trail, changed her number, purchased a second phone under a new account. Then she walked into a Baton Rouge beauty supply store, picked a new wig, soft, shoulder-length curls, and paid in cash. She changed the tone of her voice, switched up her posture, went from blunt to warm, from confident to curious. She left Mariella behind and became Ella James, 25 years old, recently relocated from Arkansas, trying to grow spiritually with a soft spot for worship music and a desire to serve. And like that, she slipped into Spirit Tabernacle as if she'd always been there. She joined the church choir her second week back, sat quietly in the alto section, didn't oversing, didn't try to stand out. She brought snacks to rehearsal, laughed when appropriate, quoted just enough scripture to be convincing. Within 2 Sundays, she was on the radar of Pastor Daniel's assistant, Tasha Valor, who casually invited her to help organize the prayer breakfast. Mariella accepted. She'd already read Tasha's entire Instagram timeline, knew her schedule, knew her allergies, knew her access level to the pastor's calendar. By week 3, Mariella had a visitor's badge with hallway access. By week 5, she had Daniel's personal number. He called her a rare light in a generation of shadows. She smiled and said she just wanted to grow under his leadership. He told her he saw her heart. She let him. His interest started subtly. At first, he tried to hold back, played coy, told her he was in a season of consecration, that he was fasting from distractions, that God was pruning him, setting him apart for greater oil. He spoke in metaphors as he always did, turning carnal desire into coded language. But Mariella Noella knew the rhythm. She'd studied him, knew when he paused too long in conversation, knew the look in his eyes when he pretended to wrestle with temptation. He wanted her, badly, and pretending not to was just part of the dance. By the 3rd week, the tone shifted. He invited her to his office after choir rehearsal, said he wanted to cover her in prayer. The door stayed unlocked, but the blinds were drawn. He asked about her past, if she'd ever been hurt by a man, if she struggled with lust. He asked if she believed in spiritual alignment, between husband and wife. Then slowly, he brought out the language he reserved only for the women he wanted to fold into his world. You don't just carry beauty, he told her, you carry weight. And I've seen it clear as day of vision, you and I walking in purpose, building together, you're my crown, my good thing. Mariella didn't flinch. She looked down as if humbled and whispered, I received that. That night, he texted her at 1:14 a.m. I know this is sudden, but the Spirit won't let me sleep. I need to see you. She sent an address. They met at a rented Airbnb on the outskirts of town. No hotels too risky. No personal house too vulnerable. The bed was already turned down. Worship music was playing low. He greeted her like she was a long-lost part of himself, kissed her hand, then her cheek, then her mouth. They slept together that night, and the next, and the next. It became routine, every Tuesday and Friday, like a schedule he didn't have to pray about. They met in different locations. He called it sanctified secrecy, told her their bond was too sacred for public eyes. He said their union was divine, that the Bible was full of hidden covenants. He preached sermons on purity during the day, and sent her voice notes at night, moaning prayers, mixing scripture with seduction, saying things like, "You taste like favor," and "I've never felt the anointing this strong through touch." Mariella let him have the illusion. She wore modest dresses on Sundays, brought banana bread to staff meetings, took notes in his leadership class, and every night they slept together. She smiled sweetly, listened carefully, and watched him destroy himself with his own arrogance. But something began to happen. At first it was easy to ignore, just an itch behind his knees, a tingling under his arms, a rawness in the back of his throat that felt like allergies. He thought it was fatigue, thought maybe he was pushing too hard, stretching himself thin between counseling, Sunday sermons, and late-night rendezvous. But then the ache settled into his joints. His fingers stiffened in the mornings. His knees popped when he stood too fast. His tongue felt heavy. His breath turned bitter, carrying a sourness that no mint or mouthwash could mask. He started sweating through his clothes. His stomach churned every time he ate. His skin, once smooth and photogenic, began to change. Patches turned red, then purple, then thick and raised. His lips cracked. His gums bled. He told himself it was stress, maybe spiritual warfare, maybe the weight of carrying the church alone. But deep down something didn't feel right. He looked in the mirror and winced. His face looked puffy, eyes sunken, a faint yellow crawling across the whites. He started scratching without realizing. His arms, his back, the base of his neck, until the skin tore beneath his nails. He fasted, 48 hours, then 72. He anointed himself with oil, prayed in tongues for hours at a time, laid on the floor of his living room, and cried out for deliverance. But the more he cried, the worse it got. The itch turned to burning. His vision blurred. His breath smelled like something dying. He canceled 2 services, said he was seeking solitude. He told his assistant not to call, told the elders to trust that God was working something deep. But in truth, he was hiding, locking himself in the master bathroom, watching sores rise on his chest like boils, his skin bubbling as if something underneath was trying to push through. On the 5th morning, he couldn't hold himself up. He stepped into the shower and collapsed. Water still running, body curled, vomit on the tile. His phone rang 3 times before he could crawl to it. The paramedics found him naked, shivering, mumbling scripture under his breath. And when they asked if he was in pain, all he said was, "Something's wrong with me. It's in me." He was rushed into St. Vincent Hospital in Baton Rouge, just before 7 a.m., barely responsive, drenched in sweat, eyes glassy, barely able to whisper his own name. The paramedics had reported a suspected seizure, but the attending nurse knew immediately this wasn't just exhaustion or dehydration. His skin was clammy, flushed in irregular blotches. His pupils were constricted. His breath was so foul it made the intake staff cover their faces. When the ER team peeled off his shirt, what they saw made the room fall quiet. His chest and arms were streaked with deep bruising, his abdomen tender to the slightest touch. And open sores had formed beneath his arms, festering with the kind of speed that no known illness should produce. Dr. Sinclair Pratt, 43, infectious disease specialist and department lead, was paged immediately. He arrived within 10 minutes, reviewed the vitals, scanned the blood panels, and frowned. Daniel's blood pressure was dropping too fast, his heart rate elevated, his white blood cell count through the roof. But it wasn't just infection, it was systemic breakdown. His skin had begun to thin like paper. The tissue on his inner thighs and lower abdomen was turning black. When they checked his mouth, they found lesions forming along the tongue, across the gums, and down his throat, rotting from the inside out. It was as if his entire body was rejecting itself. The initial diagnosis was septic shock, likely due to untreated bacterial infection, but the labs didn't line up. No typical pathogens, no common bacteria. What they found instead was something unfamiliar, a rare compound embedded deep in his bloodstream, something behaving like a hybrid of synthetic fungus and viral material. It was attacking the collagen, the protein scaffolding that holds human tissue together. This wasn't a standard infection. This was demolition. And it wasn't random. The toxicology report read like a horror story. Evidence of sustained tissue necrosis, clotting in the microvasculature, multiple organ systems already showing signs of stress. The compound had mimicked the structure of necrotic sepsis, but it wasn't bacterial. It was synthetic, engineered, designed to spread. And the most alarming part, once it attached to muscle tissue, it triggered irreversible cellular decay. His immune system wasn't fighting back because it had no idea what it was fighting. By hour 4, Daniel's fingertips had turned gray. His lips cracked open. His kidneys were failing. His tongue had started to peel. The team placed him in isolation. And in the hallway, Dr. Pratt stood with the chart in one hand and disbelief in the other. He muttered under his breath. This wasn't caught. This was delivered. Mariella Houston, Texas, 18 months earlier. A dim apartment, whiteboard covered in chemical structures. Files open on her screen. Peer-reviewed studies, clinical trial documents, academic journals detailing the behavior of necrotizing compounds. Mariella worked quietly, methodically, stringing together molecular chains, breaking them down, testing enzyme reactions. She knew what she was doing. She had access. She had knowledge. And she had nothing left to lose. She wasn't making poison. She was building a mirror. Something that would reflect everything he had done. Slowly, painfully, inescapably. A compound that didn't kill on contact. One that lingered. One that stripped a body down from the inside. That mimicked the wounds he left behind. Unseen at first. Then impossible to ignore. She created it using safe lab access. Spread out the development across different systems. Nothing traceable. Nothing that would raise flags. She logged fake notes. Worked after hours. Always wearing gloves. Always erasing history. The compound was coated with delayed activation. It needed heat. Friction. A specific pH. She'd calculated everything. Down to the hour his body would start to turn. Back in Baton Rouge, Daniel lay in ICU. Tubes down his throat. Skin blistering. Nurses wiping him down in silence, unsure what they were treating. The machines were loud. The smell? Worse. They'd never seen anything like it. But she had. She had planned every step. She had tested it. And she had delivered it, the only way he would accept it. Because the compound that now lived in his blood had entered him the night he touched her. And the condom he used was hers. The doctors were shaken. None of them said it out loud, but the looks exchanged in that ICU room told the story. His body wasn't just failing. It was falling apart. One attending physician stared at the CT scans for nearly 10 minutes without saying a word before finally whispering, "It's as though your body is decomposing from the inside." Another stood at the foot of the bed and asked if Daniel had been exposed to a biological agent. Some rare chemical. Something undocumented. No one had answers. No one had context. Just the beeping of machines. The smell of antiseptic mixed with rot. And the slow unraveling of a man who used to fill arenas with his voice. He was barely conscious when the door opened. She didn't knock. She didn't ask. She walked in slow. Calm. Mariella. Dressed in clean, crisp white from neck to ankle, like she'd stepped out of a revival tent. Her hair tied neatly, no makeup, no jewelry, just a small worn Bible in her left hand, and a stillness that seemed to quiet the entire floor. The nurse on duty tried to stop her, but something about her presence made them hesitate. No badge, no visitor sticker. Just focus. She stepped to the side of the bed, looked down at him. Daniel blinked hard, tried to form words. His mouth moved, but his lips were cracked and bleeding. His voice barely a whisper, rasping through damaged vocal cords. His right hand trembled, reaching up just a few inches before falling against his chest. She sat, slowly, deliberately, crossed her legs at the ankle, placed her Bible on the tray table beside his chart, and laid one hand softly on his chest, just above where the monitors were taped into his skin. "I'm here to pray for you," she said. Her voice was soft, controlled. No trace of anger. No trace of emotion. Just steady. Daniel looked at her. His eyes were glassy, rimmed red. One tear fell, streaking down a cheek that had once been flawless and smooth, but was now blotched, inflamed, and beginning to cave inward from the tissue breakdown beneath the surface. He nodded. Weakly. Barely. She kept her hand there for a moment longer, then leaned closer, her mouth just inches from his ear. "But before I do," she whispered, "I want to tell you a story." He blinked again, slowly. His breath was shallow. The oxygen machine hissed beside them. His body twitched from the fever. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded photo, creased at the edges, faded from time. It was Lydia, standing in front of Spirit Tabernacle, hair pulled into a bun, smile wide, holding a songbook to her chest. Mariella unfolded the photo, pressed it gently into his trembling hand, and watched as his eyes landed on it. "She believed you," Mariella said, voice just above a whisper. "She waited for you. She gave you everything." Daniel's lips quivered. His throat caught a sound that didn't quite become a word. "She thought you were the answer. She thought all the pain had a purpose. That if she just held on long enough, you'd keep your word." Mariella's tone never rose, never wavered. It was the voice of someone who had already cried every tear and now only spoke truth. "You called her daughter while you destroyed her womb. You said God would reward her suffering while you handed her silence. And when she died, you didn't even come. You let her die under a name that wasn't hers." Alone, Daniel began to cry. Weak, broken sobs. His shoulders shook barely. Mariella didn't move. She leaned in closer, so only he could hear. "The condom you used that night," she whispered. "I made it. I prepared it. I studied you. For 2 years I watched every move, every sermon, every girl you whispered lies to. I counted them." She looked into his eyes, and for the first time in hours he looked truly awake. "You're not dying because God is testing you," she said. "You're dying because I told the truth where you kept lying." Daniel shook his head slowly, as if begging for something. Mercy, forgiveness, maybe even denial. But his throat wouldn't let out the words. He was trapped in his own skin now. Trapped in the same silence he used to sentence her sister. She stood up, lifted her Bible, tucked the photo back into her bag. And then she leaned one last time over the man, who used to control every room he walked into. "I'm not here to pray for healing," she said. "I'm here to let you sit with what you are, with what you've done. Alone." She turned, walked to the door, and didn't look back. Behind her the monitors kept beeping. The rot kept spreading. The man who once stood above pulpits with pride was now left under white sheets, breath short, heart racing, eyes fixed on the one face he never expected to see again. And when the nurses came in, they said nothing. Because sometimes silence is louder than judgment. And Daniel Riggins was out of words. In the weeks that followed, Spirit Tabernacle Revival Center, once the pride of Baton Rouge's North End, crumbled from within. Attendance plummeted. Tides dried up. The once booming live streams with thousands of viewers became archives no one dared revisit. Whispers turned to questions. Questions turned to outrage. And by late October 2020, the church filed for bankruptcy. Membership had dropped by 78%. Ministries dissolved. The church van sat idle. And the building, once filled with music and declarations, fell quiet. No one wanted to be connected to a name that now carried the stench of unanswered pain. Then came the investigations. Baton Rouge PD, working with a small team of detectives and 2 advocacy groups, reopened at least 4 historical complaints against Daniel Riggins. Cases from 2016, 2017, 2019. Some closed due to lack of evidence. Others quietly dropped after intervention from church attorneys. But this time, the witnesses were different. Bolder. A few now had nothing left to fear. They came forward, described the same patterns, same lines, same scriptures twisted into shame. But even with fresh interviews, the DA had no physical proof. No timeline that could be verified without reasonable doubt. And most importantly, no living victim willing to testify in court. At the hospital, Daniel's condition only worsened. Doctors rotated in shifts just to document what they were witnessing. One specialist from LSU called it unlike any natural progression of necrosis ever recorded. The medical examiner's report would later list the official cause as self-induced microbial contamination from unknown synthetic compound, a phrase that sounded more like a hypothesis than a conclusion. Behind closed doors, physicians speculated that the exposure happened through skin contact, possibly through a barrier product. But no compound like it was ever cataloged before. No lab would claim knowledge of it, and no agency could trace its source. There were no fingerprints, no forensic trail, no witness statements that linked the incident to anything criminal, which meant no charges were filed. And Mariella Owens? She disappeared as quietly as she came. No forwarding address, no job resumption in Houston, no utility records. She had erased herself. Completely. Detective Jarrell Banks, a 26-year veteran of the Baton Rouge Police Department, was asked, during a local interview, if the case had left any regrets. He looked down for a long moment, then said this: "Some crimes don't need evidence to haunt you. Sometimes the echo of what someone did is louder than the conviction we never got." And with that, the segment ended. No bugshot, no trial, just a man who lost everything: his ministry, his voice, his face, and a woman who walked away with no applause, no vengeance speech, no trace. Justice doesn't always show up in handcuffs. Sometimes it just waits, watches, and lets people rot in exactly what they built. There's grainy footage from a visitor's phone, captured without permission, passed from inbox to inbox, quietly deleted, then re-uploaded again. It shows him slumped in a standard issue wheelchair, body thinner than most remembered, skin loose in places, blotched in others. His hands twitch uncontrollably. A drool bib hangs awkwardly across his chest. His eyes dart around the corridor like he's afraid of something, or someone, even when no one's near him. No title card, no location tag, just one line typed over the clip: "This is Pastor Daniel Riggins." Now, that footage was taken at a long-term care facility just outside Monroe, Louisiana, 3 hours north of Baton Rouge, tucked between flat farmland and a silent stretch of highway. No signage on the front lawn, no chapel, just a single brick building with 2 locked wings, where the severely immunocompromised and neurologically deteriorating are kept away from the rest of the world. He had been transferred there under medical guardianship after his condition made basic daily care impossible. The tissue damage in his mouth had reached a point where speech was no longer an option. His tongue, once used to charm, command, manipulate, was now blackened, shriveled, and partially necrotized. Doctors said he experienced constant burning in his gums, a sharp nerve pain triggered by even the smallest exposure to air. He couldn't eat solid food, couldn't form a sentence, couldn't pray his way out of bed. No visitors came. No mail arrived. The church he built no longer listed his name in its founding documents. He sat in silence, day after day. The nurses called him Mr. Riggins. No pastor, no title, just another patient waiting for pills, sponge baths, and soft food in a bowl. They said he sometimes cried when gospel music played faintly from the hallway, but never made a sound. Just tears, always silent. One nurse in an anonymous interview said she once saw him mouthing words over and over at night in his room. Couldn't tell what they were, just moving lips, slowly, frantically, as if trying to speak to someone who wasn't there. When they asked the facility to provide medical commentary for legal records, the director declined. His file now reads: nonverbal, end-stage systemic tissue degeneration, dependent on full care, DNR in place. And that's it. No legacy, no ministry, no echo of the thousands who once called his name from the altar. Just another forgotten man, swallowed by a silence he carved for someone else. He silenced her. Now the silence is his prison. If silence protects predators, then vengeance becomes prophecy. Because what happened to Lydia Owens was never just one man's failure. It was the result of every hand that clapped while she suffered, every voice that shouted amen while she was bleeding in secret, every board member who ignored the red flags, and every mother who told her to stay humble instead of asking what she was really going through. It was the silence, the willful ignorance, the loyalty to image over truth, and in the end, it cost a girl her life. Mariella Owens didn't return for applause. She didn't speak at any podium. She didn't issue any statement. She never posted a quote or sent a warning. She simply disappeared, the way those who suffer in silence often do. But she left behind a lesson that cannot be ignored, that justice doesn't always knock. Sometimes it watches, sometimes it waits, and sometimes it walks in wearing a choir robe, a smile, and the patience of someone who's already measured every consequence. We don't know where she is now. No footage, no paper trail, no confirmed location. But the story she wrote, without a pen, without a pulpit, lives on in every eye that now sees through charm, in every heart that no longer confuses scripture for submission, in every church that quietly re-examines who they've been protecting. Daniel Riggins once stood in front of thousands, claiming to speak for God, but in the end, it was his own body that testified. Slowly, painfully, truthfully, his voice failed, his face decayed, his hands trembled, and the only sermon left was silence. He was never arrested, never booked, never sentenced. But he is serving a sentence nonetheless. A life lived inside his own rotting flesh. His name erased from the church he built. His touch remembered not for healing, but for harm. His story a warning, carved in slow death and unanswered prayers. So when you think of vengeance, don't think of rage. Think of discipline. Think of strategy. Think of a woman who held her pain so quietly that the man who broke her sister mistook her for prey and walked straight into his own judgment. Because in the end, justice didn't wear a badge. It wore heels. It sang alto. It carried a Bible. And it never raised its voice. It simply watched him rot. As the rain gently falls and the night grows deeper. Thank you for joining me here at Mr. Night Scared. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying aware, even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep, and until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night watch over you.